Okay, so welcome back, everyone. We're back here at St. Thomas University in the program of Master of Science in Bioethics. And within the course of Environmental Bioethics, today we're going to be looking at cycling, natural cycles, and then human recycling, not recycling humans, but recycling the waste of humans. All right. Okay, so we begin as always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in us the fire of your divine love. We pray in a very special way during this Easter season for those who are most in need of your divine mercy. In the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, before proceeding then, any questions or comments from previous material? Nope. All right, so always framing what we're doing here, we're about halfway through the course, believe it or not, already. We have, I think we have about three more lectures to go, 4 with this one. And we've been looking at the ecosphere, which is a composite of the geosphere, right? The physical land terrain of Earth, and then the atmosphere, the gas component that is necessary for life, obviously, and also the hydrosphere, all the different types of water components on Earth. And now we're going to look at cycles, natural cycles that allow for the possibility of life. And then the second half of today's lecture is going to be on human recycling, because when we look around of the approximately 2 million species that have been classified so far on Earth, we have identified and classified, we are the only species that actually contaminates, that produces waste that is not recyclable naturally and fairly quickly. In contrast with other animals and plants and fungi and bacteria, their waste is recycled very efficiently through natural cycles. And even when the organism or even entire populations die, as for example, forests with catastrophic events, they eventually rot and become petroleum. Right, so everything else in nature is recycled naturally, but we are very unique in many ways, and one of the ways is that we produce a lot of waste, and we're producing a tremendous amount of waste as the population continues to increase. All right, so it's a very important issue that we need to address. All right, so back to natural cycles first. In the first half of the lecture, we'll talk about some of the main cycles that allow for the possibility of life, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, including carbon dioxide, oxygen cycle, nitrogen cycle, and then other natural cycles that are less evident but are still there and necessary for life. All right, so if no questions or comments, we're going to go forward now. So let's first take a look at the water cycle. We know that life is possible because of liquid water here on Earth, which has to do with our distance to the sun, our distance meaning the distance of the Earth to the sun, that allows in that narrow range that we call from 0 to 100 degrees centigrade, which really is a very narrow range as far as temperatures are concerned in the universe, allows for this amazing molecule that we call water to be in its liquid state, all right? And so really, when we look at life, organic life here on Earth, which is the only life that we know so far, we see that at the biochemical level, it is basically a soup, right? A very dynamic soup that is a bunch of chemical reactions that are super organized, which is also very curious, almost from a philosophical sense, because the general tendency in the universe is what we call entropy, which is movement of energy toward unavailable energy. like heat, for example, that diffuses from the Earth out and from other planets and suns and stars and galaxies out into the universe. As it diffuses, it loses its heat, its power, if you will. And so there is a gradual tendency toward disorder in nature, in the universe. But in contrast to that, here in this little tiny planet, Earth, we have like a counter eddy of this entropy, of the general movement toward disorder in the process of life, of organic life, metabolism, which you know that metabolism is just a fancy word for life at the cellular level or at the level of the whole organism, all right? Metabolism is subdivided into two categories, whether we're building up molecules or breaking down molecules, typically large organic molecules that we call macromolecules. And so building up is anabolism and breaking down is catabolism. It's just a little review of little biochemistry way back. So ana constructs and kata destroys. Anabolism is the building up of molecules. For example, making proteins out of amino acids. Or making DNA or RNA out of nucleic acids, and so forth. The four macromolecules, the four major groups of macromolecules, the proteins, the lipids, the carbohydrates, and the nucleic acids, right? DNA and RNA. You with me so far? Just review of high school biochemistry. All right, catabolism is the breaking down of those molecules, typically into some waste that eventually we excrete or secrete, mostly through the urine. Because the digestive tract is kind of independent, it's semi-independent. You can look at the digestive tract as essentially a tube, a dynamic tube from the mouth to the anus, that food goes through there, all right, and we absorb some of that food, but not all. Maybe about, about 40% more or less. I don't think we even absorb half of the nutrition that is available in the food that we eat. The other half goes out as roughage and feces. But others take care of the rest of the waste. The point is that it's only the nutrients that are absorbed, mostly in the large intestine, small intestine, and some of the large intestines, that are used by our body for metabolism, okay? But the real metabolic waste is not the feces. The real metabolic waste is the urine, which is also a soup. In other words, what I'm trying to point out here is that water is remember the almost universal solvent, right? The almost universal solvent. It means that the vast majority of substances dissolve in water, okay? And the ones that don't dissolve in water, like lipids, for example, and greases and fats and oils and so forth, they dissolve in alcohol, and alcohol dissolves in water. So alcohol can be an intermediate to get stuff dissolved into water. Also, while I'm on it, I want to make a distinction between a solution and a suspension, all right? For example, when we put salt into water and we mix it up, we get salt water or salty water, right? And what happens to that salt? If I let the glass of salt water sit for a period of time, a few hours or a few days, I come back to it, is the salt remaining in solution, or has the salt precipitated out? Let's assume it's not saturated or not super saturated, right? In principle, the salt would remain in solution, so that all of the water column will still be salty. And in principle, in a dynamic equilibrium of equal percentage, if we will, equal density of salt throughout the whole glass of water, all right? Whether I take from the top, the middle, the bottom, the edge, the center, it should have in principle an equal distribution of salt. In fact, salt itself ionizes, it breaks up the mineral, sodium and chloride and chlorine. One is positive charge and one is negative charge. And those charges are going to interact with the charges of what? Of the water magnet. So when you get down to the molecular level, that's why I say think functionally. We certainly can't see it with the eye. We would need a super duper microscope of not even an electron microscope would see at that level of ions, all right? There are some microscopes now, proton microscopes and so forth, that approach those kinds of small molecules. But basically we know, because of the configuration of the water molecule, that it acts as a magnet, all right? So if you think that functionally, sodium chloride, what's the formula for sodium chloride? Just table salt. Anyone remember? NaCl, right? NaCl. Na is for what element? Sodium, which the original Latin name is natrium, and that's where we get the Na, natrium, okay? And chlorine, Cl, right? Sodium happens to be a cation, meaning positive, and chlorine happens to be an anion, meaning negative. So what's going to happen is they dissociate, the sodium chloride minerals, crystals, dissociate in water, right? And they are going to be coated and interact with the water molecules. So we can expect the sodium atom to hang around where on the water molecule? The bold spot, exactly, which is the negative spot, okay? Bold is negative, and so the sodium will be around here somewhere, exactly. Whereas the chlorine is gonna like to hang around with the hydrogens, which are positive, because chlorine is negative, right? And opposite poles attract. But it happens that there's only one negative, if you will, one oxygen, but two hydrogens. And so two chlorines are going to tend to hang around to each hydrogen, but only one sodium. So, but we know that sodium chloride as a salt, straight up sodium chloride, has only one sodium and one chlorine. All right, so the redistribution of those ions in the water is going to be different from the original composition. Mm-hmm. And there may be, so if we do it arithmetically, just by the mind, we can think that we're going to run out of chlorines, right? Because each water molecule, in principle, would only take one sodium and one chlorine from the NaCl, mm-hmm. which means that they're going to be leftover hydrogen atoms unbonded. They're going to be competing for the bold spot of the oxygen with the sodium. Mm-hmm. And so there's going to be a dynamic interaction that is super active, all occurring at the molecular and the atomic level in that glass of water without us worrying about it or even thinking about it. And that is keeping, the end result is that is keeping the sodium chloride in suspension, literally suspended within the water column in this dynamic interaction of the bouncing of molecules. Now, if we add heat to that, that is going to make the interaction even faster. They're going to jump around even faster among each other, trying to grab the positives and the negatives. So you can imagine the confusion for us, for my brain, the confusion that is going on inside that glass, but it's all perfectly organized for them. You know, they're competing according to the energetic equivalencies and whatever the mini micro heat that is available for them throughout the water column, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Anyway, all that to say that solution, that sodium chloride, that mineral is going to remain in solution. Different from a suspension. A suspension may go into the water column temporarily, all right, but will come out of the water column and eventually settle at the bottom or at the top if it's less dense than the water itself. So a very simple example is sand. You take sand, even fine sand. I don't know if you've been to the West Coast, but they have that coquina sand, a very fine sand that is almost powdery, right, white. So very fine sand, you put it in a glass and you shake it up and it will suspend into the water column, but only temporarily, because if you set that down, you come back to it, a few minutes, a few hours, or even a few days later, eventually that sand is going to settle out of suspension and settle to the bottom, right? Now, it may be that the glass, the water becomes cloudy and remains cloudy. What does that mean about the sand? That the sand was impure and that it had mixed with the sand, right, which doesn't dissolve in water, right, because they're mostly silica crystals or calcium carbonate, which doesn't dissolve in water. In addition to the sand itself, to the minerals that make up the sand, there were some other minerals there that did dissolve in the water and made it cloudy, all right? And so you can get both. You can get, and in fact, you can get that with juices. You can translate that to the organic level when you make a juice, for example, like a smoothie, all right? You take several fruits and you put it in the blender, you add water and you shake it up. So you're gonna get a suspension and a solution. If you let that glass sit for a while, there will be a sediment at the bottom, okay? Which are the fruit fiber, essentially, that suspended out. But also the water column is not going to be crystal clear. I can guarantee you that. It's going to be a cloudy color, typically on the brownish side, or whatever fruit we put in there, reddish, whatever. Okay, so you're going to have both. You're going to have a suspension and a solution, but they're different, distinct. Okay, so the big issue about the metabolism is mostly that it is this solution that is going on, or it could be a suspension, but water makes it possible. And by far, the largest ingredient in any solution is going to be water, okay? The largest component. So the water cycle is very important for maintaining life. And it does cycle, and it basically cycles between, mostly between liquid and gas, but also sometimes solid by way of snow or ice. Okay. That's kind of a long introduction here, but again, picking up on last week's lecture on the importance of water and the particular properties of water that we saw, the physical and chemical properties of water, okay? Now applied to nature. Let's start with the ocean, where we have the vast majority of natural water on Earth, over 90% of it, remember, right? From that pie chart, about, I think it was about 97% of the volume. So what happens at the surface of the ocean, eventually a bunch of water molecules break through what? Break through the surface tension, right? And go into the atmosphere. And now, so they have transitioned from liquid to gas. Gas is not restricted by its own shape, if you will, in contrast with a solid, all right? And so gas is going to essentially fill the size of the container, but because these water molecules, like any molecule, does have some mass, what is going to limit the container, what container am I talking about in nature? When water evaporates from the ocean and goes into the atmosphere, the actual atmosphere is the container, all right? It's this thin layer around the entire Earth. Going to be held in place mostly by gravity. All right. So evaporation will tend to diffuse out and up, all right, into the thinner atmosphere. But as it rises, putting together, now we're putting the hydrosphere and the atmosphere concepts together. As any molecule rises in the atmosphere, in the troposphere first, right? What's going to happen with temperature? Cooling. With cooling, we have condensation. And so condensation will make what we call clouds. Cloud formation is condensation of water vapor. Those clouds are going to be pushed by wind patterns, which are the wind patterns on top of the ocean, which is a major contributor to the weather patterns on land, right? Remember that we have to go back and forth between volume and surface. The surface of the Earth is also mostly water, about 3/4, I think it's about 73% or around 75% more or less, 3/4 of the surface of the sphere, okay? And so the ocean currents that we saw, especially the big gyres, but also the smaller currents that are more localized, are going to influence what? On top of the oceans, is going to influence the atmosphere on top of the ocean, and it's going to create or generate wind currents that follow. For example, I talked about the Gulf Stream and the whole range of clouds. It looks like a mountain range out there of covered snow, right? They're moving on top of the Gulf Stream. They're following the Gulf Stream, basically. But then you have winds, and the general pattern of winds is from the ocean onto land, generally, during the day, when there is heating going on, because as the air heats up, it expands, and it's expanding out from the oceans, if you will. So it's going to expand, take the Atlantic. The Atlantic is going to expand into North America, the North Atlantic, and it's going to expand into Europe on the other side. So the general pattern of ocean breeze, if you will, during the day is air moving into land, from the ocean to the land, all right? At night, that cycle reverses because that mass of air, if you will, is cooling with no sunlight, and now it's kind of contracting, and so the air is pulled out of Earth back onto the ocean, if you will. So generally, the breezes from land is a land breeze pushing out at night. So it reverses. And I know that from sailing, that if you want to get to shore and you want to have your wind to the back, you better get in before sunset, otherwise you're going to have winds against you. You're going to have to tack in at night without knowing where you're going. So, anyway, those are general patterns, all right? There are exceptions. What's going to happen then, if you have this mass of air pushing from the ocean onto land, is going to push anything that it's hanging on it, and what's hanging on it is the clouds that get pushed in. We have a perfect example here because the general pattern of winds here in South Florida is from the Caribbean in general, from the islands inward. So it's a southeast breeze. If you stand on Miami Beach and you just expose your body out to the Atlantic, you feel the breeze coming generally from the east or the southeast, right? Which is warmer water, therefore warmer air there, and it's pushing onto land and so forth. Picks up the clouds from the Gulf Stream and pushes them onto land. On land, they tend to condense and precipitate. So precipitation is just a fancy word for rainfall. Happens more in the summer because it's warmer, and typically in the afternoon, by the time the clouds get here and condense and do all that they need to do, it's typically the summer afternoon thunder showers. There you have it. It's a complexity of hydrology and the hydrosphere interacting with the atmosphere and all that. Okay, so we got precipitation. We're down to 6 already here, right? Then deposition. So there's going to be precipitation in different places. It could be along the coast or it could be up on the mountains. If the precipitation is up in the mountains, it will be so high that the water will crystallize and it makes essentially snowflakes and will fall and deposit on snow-capped mountains, which are typically, I think, about above 10 or 11,000 feet above sea level. You can get snow-capped mountains, and we have them in the major cordilleras, what do you say, ranges of the world. Beginning with South America, the Andes. The equivalent in North America is what? The Rockies, and in Mexico is called the Sierra Madre Occidental, because we have another one in the east, right? The Oriental, just like we have the Appalachians, but no permanent snow there. But Andes, Rocky Mountains, permanent snow. Then in Europe, we have the Alps, and then between Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent, the Himalayas, right? There are a few other around, but they tend to be a little more spotty. In Africa, in Asia, the Urals, and there are a number of other ranges around that also have snow-capped mountains that tend to be individual peaks or short ranges, right? But the major ones are the ones that I mentioned. And To this day, they still have some snow on them. That snow is gradually, but surely receding because of the global warming. And that is also going to affect glaciers. Glaciers, by the way, are very slow moving. They're huge. We looked a little bit at glaciers earlier. And you know what makes the glacier move? Of course, it's the force of gravity, but we're talking about ice in contrast to liquid water. It is mostly what makes the glacier grow and move, and it typically moves in one direction. Well, it does have a pulse. It does have a cycle back and forth. But what regrows or refurbishes a glacier, basically, is just snow falling at the head of the glacier, or the, actually I don't know if it's the head or the tail, but the beginning of the glacier, the high altitude, where it would be in a region that is snow-capped mountains, is literally the snow that is falling on it that over time accumulates, and the snow compresses on top of each other and starts crushing into ice, and that makes the glacier eventually. So you can imagine the amount of snow that needs to fall to make a glacier, but it does, because these are long-term cycles, and that's how it happens. If you've ever lived up north, you know about the weight of snow, because the roofs, a flat roof is a big no-no up north, right? Because it would accumulate too much snow and they would actually collapse. 2, 3, 4 feet of snow is tremendously, it weighs a lot because it's water, all right? And
you know when you have to shovel snow.
Yes, exactly. That's right. It kills your back because snow can be very heavy. It looks very nice and puffy and friendly and fun, but after shoveling, the first day is fun. The second day is torture. The third day, I'm moving back to Miami because I've lived up north several times and can't handle it. Anyway, just to point out that there's deposition of liquid water below the snow cap, below 10,000 feet, essentially, more or less, which is about the edge of the troposphere, right, at 10 kilometers. But then there is also precipitation up high, at high altitude, in the form of solid water, which is the snow, and that tends to hold there for a while, which is also the feeder for what? For streams that eventually become rivers, and that brings fresh water down in liquid form for all kinds of life to occur through the stream and through the river, inside and outside, right? Okay, so snow is also very important to preserve, not just for the beauty of it, but the functionality of holding water, especially when there's the dry season, when there's not going to be precipitation, but there is water available from that stream or river or lake, etc. Okay, Emma?
Yes, I have a question about polar bears.
Mm-hmm.
Are they close to being extinct because they're hungry?
Okay, so the polar bear, we're going to look at that a little bit more closely in one of the other lectures where we look at the global warming and climate change. I'll show you some videos and so forth. But basically, their habitat is being constrained. They're losing habitat, which is the two caps, all right? But significantly, the North Pole. And since the North Pole is shrinking, literally that huge ice cube that we have up there, then they're losing habitat. They may be on the way to extinction. They're sorely protected. They're an endangered species, okay? However, that is shrinking, and hypothetically, some could adapt, even though they have a white coat, they could adapt to life without snow, potentially, or without ice, potentially. After all, they're carnivores, they're top carnivores, and they could hunt seals in rocky terrain. I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. But as recently as about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a report of the invasion of polar bears in some towns up in Russia, in some place in Russia, in Siberia. I don't know if you saw that. There's an island up there. This island is within the Arctic Circle, all right? And it has population of people, including schools and stuff. And all of a sudden, the polar bears started wandering around the town, and it was very scary. It was a serious situation, right? I think about 12 or 2 dozen polar bears migrated onto this island. because they felt kind of pushed out of their own native habitat. So bottom line, Gemma, I don't know exactly if they're on the way to extinction, but it looks that way. Also, a couple of weeks ago, there was a report that came out of the scientific community of data that was accumulated over decades. And essentially, the bottom line of that report, which is very extensive and detailed, is that we're possibly heading toward a sixth mass extinction on Earth, right? Sixth mass extinction of species overall, due to mostly loss of habitat. I'm going to pick up on that theme later as we get into the human factor of it. The last mass extinction was 65 million years ago, which was the loss of the dinosaurs with that meteorite, for which we had nothing to do with it because we weren't even around, right? But this one, if it is true, it would be anthropogenic, meaning that we would cause it in general, the human population of the human species, okay? A single species. So it is, the issue is serious. It's kind of long-term, but it's accelerating. It's on an exponential curve, not linear. And so that's why you have even the Pope writing encyclicals on it, because it's a big concern. So the polar bear is indicative of the cause, right? You've seen those, I'm sure you've seen those photographs of polar bears standing on top of a little tiny iceberg, chunk of ice, and just cramped in there, right? It's very impactful. All right. After precipitation, there will be runoff, water runoff on the surface of the geosphere, on the surface of the planet, down the mountains, along the valleys, through the valleys, and so forth. So there will be surface flow runoff, but also some of that water will seep in on the ground and become what is known as groundwater, and that is known, the process is infiltration and percolation, all right? So some of that precipitated water, as it flows down, it will seep through, a lot will seep through. Like for example, here when we have a sandy terrain typically, it could be a downpour out there and you go out 10 minutes later and it may be still moist and wet, but you don't find a puddle anywhere because it's sandy and it just rains right through. But eventually that water is going to stop somewhere underneath us, and it's called the water table or the aquifer, the Biscayne aquifer, which is a whole series of caves and networks that are underneath the peninsula. And you can think of it as basically Swiss cheese out of calcium carbonate, out of limestone, that is full of this water, which is crystalline, very pure. Alkaline is very basic because it's picking up a lot of minerals, mostly cations, as it percolates, all right, down to the water table. So here's the groundwater, or the water table underneath. Some root systems can reach that water table and then they're in the money because they have a constant source of fresh water. That could be what happens with these huge slash pine. The root system is anywhere between 2 to 4 times the size of what we see of the shoot, which is above ground, right? And they have humongous root systems way down there because they're conifers, and the conifer has a taproot that is constantly, has positive geotropism, meaning that gravity is constantly pulling on it and it's reacting to gravity. The only thing that is impeding it to go down is rock. If it hits a rock, it will go around the rock and keep going down. All right, just like the water. So it's essentially tracing the water. So if the water stops, the root will stop right into that. And they have a source of fresh water deep down like no other plant does. And that's why they are the dominant species in a community like this that we call, when it stabilizes, we call it a climax community. All right, so there is a cycle of water, right? Kind of circular, from the oceans to the land, back to the ocean eventually, either through rivers, surface flow, or groundwater flow underneath. Even springs, we used to have here on Biscayne Bay, freshwater springs that would come out in the middle of the bay. The water was so abundant. And the Tequesca and the other native Indians here, they would go with their canoes out to this springs of freshwater coming out on Biscayne Bay, which is very shallow. Biscayne Bay is an average of about 5 feet. You can walk mostly Biscayne Bay. You can walk from Bay Shore across to Key Biscayne, most of the area, except the canals that have been dug. Anyway, they would go out there with their canoes and anchor themselves with a stick or something onto the freshwater spring, and they would fish around it for several days, and they had a source of fresh water there in the middle of the bay, right? And it was very plentiful because of the mix with the fresh water as it mixes in with the salty water. It's makes for an abundance of life, of sea life, and not only fish, but turtles and whatnot in a primitive state. That only happened about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, at the end of the 1800s. That's still the lifestyle that was here in the peninsula. Compare that to Brickell Avenue, for example, today. Right? Super urbanized, right? Okay, so those are cycles. To keep in mind that even freshwater lakes and even rivers also evaporate to a lesser extent than the ocean, but they evaporate. In fact, they evaporate faster because fresh water evaporates more than salt water. Or actually, no, I take that back. We add a little bit of salt to the water to make it boil faster. Actually, yeah, it breaks up the pattern of the water column. Okay, so anyway, that is the water cycle. The last step that I want to mention is number 10 here, really, which is for our purpose the most important one, is absorption of water by plants. Absorption of water by plants, okay, which is basic for plant metabolism, because the plant is going to mix that water with another molecule that it gets from the atmosphere. What is that other molecule? Not nitrogen, but nitrogen is for the nutrients. But from the atmosphere, the plant gets CO2, carbon dioxide. And the mixing of CO2 and water makes glucose. So it's a transfer of energy that is extremely elegant. It's amazing. If we could replicate that process at some point, photosynthesis, we'd be all set as far as energy is concerned. Okay, so let's go there. Questions on the water cycle? I've kind of belabored it a little bit, but it's always a hard balance. I find it hard to balance between breadth and depth, right? Because, yep.
For the levees, where do they place them, and what do they do to fix them after the hurricane?
Yeah, so levees are typically in low-lying areas like Louisiana, along the bayou, along the coastline, which in its natural state tends to flood periodically, but people hard-headed wanted to post civilization there. Probably started as a port, as a seaport that had a lot of commerce and trade and so forth back a few centuries ago when the French were there. And eventually New Orleans came about, right? Or New Orleans. Orléans is a big city in France. This is New Orleans, just like York and New York and so forth. Anyway, those levees are to contain the water outside. Even in Holland, they have the levees and they have the dikes, right? But you know, nature doesn't forgive, because that land belongs to the bottom of the ocean, and nature wants to reclaim it periodically. So those levees have to be reinforced periodically, and earthworks and so forth, and it's a constant effort. I think Holland has managed to extract about 50% of its country out of its surface from the ocean. It's kind of shallow there, and they keep pushing the ocean back and claiming ocean floor, but you know, at a cost, at a big technological cost and so forth, but they've done it, and that's where they plant those huge fields of tulips that you can see to the horizon, okay? And they've made a whole industry out of it, multi-million-dollar economy, which I suppose helps them to maintain those levees and dikes and dams, right? But those are all man-made, and they have to be monitored very closely.
What are those levees?
So levees, I think, is more like earth berms, earth containers, if you will, something like this, you know, between the lake and the ocean, but man-made earthworks that are pushed up to contain the water on one side and the land, so that the water doesn't flood the land. okay? And they can be done either on fresh water or salt water. The problem with salt water is much more complex because you have to deal with tides and currents and all that. So in addition to a tide that is constantly moving up and down here is causing, if you will, vertical erosion, there typically is a current along the coast that is either going to go north or south, and that's why you see this dip in here, right? Because that is all sand. Probably originally the coastline was this, and all this sand has been removed by the current, which is mostly horizontal movement. So you have a combination of vertical and horizontal. The net result of that is a lot of erosion. If it weren't for this berm up here, that ocean eventually would dig its way all the way into the lake, right? Now, what would prevent that erosion if we planted what here? Mangrove, exactly, because the mangrove would stabilize the coast, right? And you see that it's barren. It's not, so the coastline will continue until it hits rock or vegetation that will contain it. All right, carbon cycle in nature. This is at the cellular level. So we're going to look at the carbon cycle in 3 layers: at the cellular level, at the biochemical level, and then the big cycle of CO2 in nature as a whole. All right? All right, so at the cellular level, it's a back and forth between photosynthesis and cell respiration or cellular respiration. So this is a cycle. And here's our carbon by way of what? By way of CO2, carbon dioxide, all right? Which is, it's interesting to see that of the 4 main molecules here in the cycle between photosynthesis and respiration, the 4 molecules are CO2, H2O, O2, diatomic oxygen, right, the one that we breathe, and glucose. Of these 4, occurring in a organic cycle, the only organic molecule of these 4, which is the only organic molecule? One.
Oxygen.
No, because remember, organic molecule has to have carbon and hydrogen. People know about the carbon, but they forget about the hydrogen. So oxygen is not an organic molecule, even though it's essential for life. Water is not an organic molecule. CO2 is not an organic molecule. Glucose is the only organic molecule, okay? So it's interesting to see that these very small molecules, 2 atoms, 3 atoms, all right, are essential for the cycle, and all of the cycle is to either produce glucose or to burn glucose to get its energy out of it. So there's a cycle of matter here, there's a cycle of matter, and we can then take it down to the 3 basic elements that are cycling. What are the 3 basic elements that are cycling here? We can just go across. One element is carbon. The next one, oxygen, and the next one, hydrogen. And they keep repeating in different forms, right? But it's 3 elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, that are circulating by way of different types of molecules. So these 3 elements, which make up the matter, the material, are circulating between respiration and photosynthesis, okay? And that allows for a transfer of energy, which is very exciting because it transfers light energy into chemical energy, okay? Who is storing the chemical energy? The glucose. CO2 storing the chemical energy, not available. There's energy holding the bonds together, right? Holding the oxygens to the carbons together. There's energy that is holding, but that energy is not available. The water molecule energy is not available. Even the diatomic oxygen is not available. The glucose energy is then what is available for doing work, what we call kinetic energy. So it's potential energy that through the burning, through metabolism, right, through respiration, that energy is going to be released and used for recharging ATPs, which is the actual energy molecule of the cell. So it's a transfer of energy from light energy to chemical energy. And that chemical energy is specifically stored in the bonds of the glucose molecule. And even more specifically in the carbon bonds. So the glucose molecule has a carbon skeleton, a 6-carbon skeleton, backbone, if you will, 6 carbons. And in the bonds of the carbons, specifically, that's where this chemical energy is stored as potential energy. So think of it as a battery that has potential energy either to run the computer or the radio or whatever other machine one is running. Okay, so this energy transfer is very exciting because what is the source of light energy in nature? The big one, the sun, which is available as long as the sun is out, or basically the earth facing the sun. We have an essentially inexhaustible, for now, for the next few million years, inexhaustible source of light energy. To transfer that and to trap it, and most of the light energy from the sun is lost. It either bounces out or is transformed into heat, which is lost. It's part of, it goes into entropy, right? Dissipates out into the environment. So we glow basically as a planet. But some of that energy, a very tiny, minute amount, is trapped into the glucose molecule. And now the glucose molecule is like a tiny, tiny microscopic battery that we can use. We, all living systems, so this is universal process, for obtaining that energy, that chemical energy, to do the metabolism that is needed for life. So it's absolutely elegant process. It was here millions of years before we got here, you know, billions actually. And the speculation is that these two organelles, so you're familiar with organelle, an organelle is a structure inside a cell that has a function similar to an organ has a function inside a body, all right? Only that this is microscopic, so we see the cell as the whole living thing, the basic unit of life, and it has all these organelles. For example, what is the function of the nucleus in the cell?
To store DNA.
Genetic, to store the DNA and to preserve it and to pass it out to the next generation and so forth. So it's a vital function, right? It's a double membrane and everything else. All right. This other, the chloroplast is an organelle, not inside the nucleus, it's in the cytoplasm of the cell, basic stuff. And the function of chloroplast, photosynthesis, to make this energy transformation from light into chemical energy, in other words, to make glucose. It's a very mechanical thing. It's amazing. Down to the atomic level, it's a very mechanical thing of the transfer of electrons and protons and so forth. Then the glucose is now available for metabolism of the plant itself, because people forget plants also respire because plants are alive. So plants use up some of the energy that they produce. They use it up, they also consume it. But by comparison, they produce much more glucose than the one that they use, you know, and excess. And so overall, that's what we call them producers. Remember the trophic levels, the food cycle, the food chain, food pyramid, and all that? All right. So the producers, even though they also, because they're alive, they metabolize, they need to respire, they need to burn up some of the glucose they use. For the rest of us, consumers, right? The ones who eat the plants, the primary consumers, what's another name for them? Because they eat plants, they eat herbs, they're the herbivores, right? That's the primary consumers. Then the ones who eat the primary consumers are either carnivores or omnivores, if they can also eat plants and animals, like some animals eat plants and animals, okay? They're omnivores. They're in the middle of that food pyramid. And then the top consumers typically are strict or obligatory carnivores. They feed on only animals, all right? And the trophic level of the 10-to-1 ratio and all that. Okay, so the organelle responsible for burning the glucose is the mitochondria. And as this mitochondria is not just an open fire out there that's burning glucose, okay? It's a very controlled reaction. And what it does is another transfer of energy. We call it recharging ATPs because there is the ATP molecule Scientific name, ATP, is an acronym for adenosine triphosphate. I just want to show you the carbon, the bonds, the transfer. Here is the ATP molecule, images. Okay, any one of them. It has these 3 phosphates, that's large enough, yeah. All right. It's a pentose, it's a ring, it's a carbohydrate, all right? When the atoms are not shown on these stick bonds of these chemical formulas, when the atoms are not shown, the element is not shown, it implies what? A carbon. Okay, so there's a carbon here, there's a carbon here, 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 there's a carbon here, 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 okay? And the atom, because carbon is so common in organic molecules that they're not shown just to not make it cloudy, all right? Or, yeah. But the relevant carbons are shown, like this one here. And here is, so this whole area, this is an adenine, by the way, which is a double ring. It's a nitrogenous double ring. The same adenine that makes the DNA, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, remember? All right, ACTG. All right, so it's the same adenine with a pentose sugar hanging here, and then an arm that extends with 3 phosphates. So this is the triphosphate. So adenine plus the sugar makes adenosine, all right? And then the arm, the phosphate arm sticking out because it has 3 phosphates, is a triphosphate. So adenosine triphosphate. What happens, these bonds, these phosphate bonds, are high energy bonds, okay? And these high energy bonds are available for metabolism, for either anabolism or catabolism, mostly for anabolism, the building up of those molecules. We have to insert energy. It's like boiling water. You need to insert the heat to boil the water, okay? Only that this one, instead of heat energy, is chemical energy. So these bonds are broken one by one, and the first one to break is the outside bond. This one releases X kilocalories that is used for connecting other molecules together, for building molecules together, like, for example, amino acids into proteins. So the release of this energy leaves 1 phosphate group floating around, and then this becomes an adenosine, what? Instead of diphosphate. You can break a second bond, get more energy out of it, all right? And then you have 2 phosphates floating around, and this is down to adenosine 1 monophosphate, mono di-tri, okay? So mono di-tri. Once this is down to a monophosphate, it needs to be recharged. Goes to the mitochondria, gets recharged. In other words, the transfer of energy is going to be from the glucose molecule to this first bond, and then more glucose molecule to the second bond. And this guy is going to come out at the other end, triphosphate, and ready to be recycled. So you see the transfer of energy is absolutely elegant, okay? Back to the molecule here. So we call that respiration when the glucose is burned. And to do that burning, it's chemically burning is an oxidation reaction. Oxidation because it requires oxygen. So oxygen is what is known as an oxidant, all right? Oxygen is needed for burning. Just like to put it out a fire, you cut off its oxygen, right? For example, in a candle, you cap it, and it consumes the oxygen that is used there, no more oxygen. So oxygen is needed, and that's why it's an oxidation reaction. When glucose is burned, it's an oxidation reaction, right? Oxidizing glucose is the same as burning glucose. So that's the oxygen that is needed, that is a byproduct of photosynthesis. It's a byproduct of photosynthesis. So what happens here when glucose is burned is broken down into 2 main components, CO2 and water. So the 2 products, the 2 byproducts of respiration is carbon dioxide and water, all right? That go back into the cycle So this water is going to go through the water cycle that we just saw, and this CO2 is going through the water cycle that we're looking at now. Frankly, just too much detail, but this is the whole reaction. It's called a redox reaction. Again, it's an acronym, it's kind of a abbreviation. Here is the oxidation part of the reaction. Oxidation is the burning, cellular respiration, and the reduction reaction is this one. So CO2 and water are being reduced. The CO2 is being reduced into glucose, all right? Being reduced of its oxygen, basically. And so that is the reduction part of the reaction, is the photosynthesis. And the oxidation part of the reaction is the respiration. And that's why it's called a redox reaction. And it's balanced back and forth, all right? So if we start at the atmosphere, we have the CO2, which is in what state? Of the three, what are the three possible states?
Gas.
Solid, liquid, gas. It's in gas state. In other words, it's in the atmosphere, right? It's in solution or in suspension in the atmosphere, the CO2. It's in solution. It's in solution in the atmosphere. There's essentially, there should be, in principle, the same amount of CO2 in this pocket of air, that in that pocket of air, that in China's pocket of air. Well, they're going to have more CO2 over there. And Mexico City also. We can think of a few cities, yeah. Okay, but basically the CO2 is dissolved. It's in the atmosphere, all right? And the water, the groundwater, right? The root system that we just saw in liquid form is being absorbed. That water, by the way, is that water being absorbed just as pure H2O? No. The absorption system of the roots synergizes, takes advantage of the fact that the water is the almost universal solvent and is going to absorb what? Nutrients. So it's not just pure H2O, right? In fact, I think that pure H2O on a root system would actually kill the roots because it will leach out its nutrients. Is water that has nutrients dissolved in it, precisely nitrogen, which is going to be nitrogen, nitrates and phosphates, or some of the main nutrients for the plant, which the plant's going to use for making its own tissue. All right. For example, its own proteins and lipids and carbohydrates, whatever. So the water component that is being absorbed is mixed with the CO2. So the water absorbed from the roots, CO2 absorbed from the leaves, the underside of the leaf, okay? And that in the chloroplast, through the process that we call photosynthesis, is going to make glucose. And a side product, a waste product of photosynthesis is oxygen, which comes out of the leaf into the atmosphere, all right? Then when we look at the reverse process, the oxidation, oxygen is used to burn the glucose. Where do animals get, or even plants, the tissue, where do they get the oxygen? From the atmosphere that was produced by the plants, and it's hanging around. And the glucose that is going to come in the form of nutrition, right? Of either plant material or animal material that ate plant material, okay? And that is going to get burnt up, and byproducts, waste products from respiration are going to be CO2 and H2O. Now, people are aware that we exhale carbon dioxide, right? People are not aware generally that we also exhale water in the form of what state? Water vapor, gas. There it is. Okay, it's not magic. I didn't make that up. Boom. Okay, that's water vapor that I exhaled. All right, so we naturally dehydrate every time we breathe, every time we exhale. And that's why we need to rehydrate. That's part of the reason. Okay, so we're constantly losing water, either water gas or water liquid, by way of waste. All right, enough. Forward. Otherwise, they can be here for days. We don't want to do that. Carbon in nature. All right, we're going to back out from the biochemistry, from the cellular respiration and photosynthesis. We're going to look at the bigger picture in nature, and we have the cycle. Let's start with, let's start with fossil fuels getting burnt up by what we call the economy or industry. We produce CO2 into the atmosphere by burning the fossil fuels. 3 states, right? Solid, known as coal, liquid, thick liquid, petroleum, and gas, natural gas. Very significant, a lot of it. All right, so industry runs on that, and transportation, everything else. It keeps us alive. And now we pump CO2 into the atmosphere. We're not the only ones. There are also natural fires or man-made fires. They also produce a lot of CO2. Cellular respiration, all the animals and plants. There should be another red arrow here too. All right, plants are also producing CO2, small amount, relatively speaking. There's also geological activity, mostly volcanoes. Did you hear the other one that exploded recently? The Etna in Italy exploded, and in Mexico City, I think the Popocatépetl was also had an active fumarole. Yeah, it's all, there's still a lot of volcanic activity going on in the world today. The ring of fire around the Pacific Rim, all of it. Mm-hmm. All right, so CO2 is being pumped out by the red arrows, but then is being sucked in back into the ground eventually, and that is what is called carbon sinking. Carbon sinking, very important because we need to maintain that. Remember that 94% of the 0.1% of the atmosphere, remember that was trace elements? So 3/4 of it is, of the atmosphere, nitrogen, about 21% or something like that, 20% is oxygen. Then we have argon, I think it is, or another gas. And then there's that 1% of trace elements. And within that 1%, many other gases. The largest amount of that 1% is CO2, which is about a 94% or something like that, 90 something. So that level needs to stay around there because if it fluctuates just a little bit, it causes a big impact. So this is a case where little tiny yeast will cause the whole mass of dough to rise or not. Literally, that's actually CO2 in the bread that makes it rise, those bubbles. The CO2 bubble. All right. All right, so sinking, carbon sinking is very important to maintain the balance in nature. Sinking happens a lot through photosynthesis, but not only. Also, some CO2 dissolves in water. It's trapped by rainwater or even the ocean surface, and also through rivers. Any kind of liquid water is going to, CO2 is going to mix in liquid water. Just like O2 mixes in liquid water, and we have what is called oxygenated water, right? The CO2 in the air component, what we have actually is not oxygenated water, it's aerated water. You know, on the tap, when you open and you have the little filter that makes it foamy, kind of, right? It's not just a strong column of water, but you get a water foam with a little filter that you have to clean out every now and then because it gets minerals and gets sedimented. Okay, so that's aerating the water. We call it oxygenating, but it's actually, it's not just oxygen, it's the whole atmosphere, including CO2. So CO2 can also go into solution in water, and when that water goes into the groundwater, it keeps going down and gets trapped down there. Also by the composition of animals, which also has carbon, all that is sinking carbon into the geosphere, all right, sedimentation and all that. And so this is an essential process to maintain the balance of carbon in nature. Now, we can look at this picture because this is extra. This is extra mostly in the past 300 years since the Industrial Revolution in relatively large quantities, which did not exist. I mean, there's no other creature that goes into the soil and taps into the petroleum and burns petroleum, all right, or coal or anything like that because they don't need it. They're in balance. So this little sliver of the caricature here is relatively new. 300 years is nothing. for geologic time. We're talking about thousands of times, hundreds of thousands, or millions of years. All right. And this is what it's causing. So this is the budget, the annual carbon budget, right? Estimated from scientific research. Again, you see down here, this is all the sunk CO2. It's all the sunk CO2, even in the soil, down to the fossil pool, which this would be a mixture of coal and petroleum and natural gas pockets. All of that is down here. Also, the ocean maintains in solution some of the CO2, and some of it gets sedimented down in the ocean floor, deeply. All right, so let's look at some CO2 release. The green is natural CO2 release, okay? The green on land and the blue is in the oceans. So let's stick to these numbers first. We see, okay, so these are gigatons, which is a huge amount, right? A metric ton is 1,000 kilograms. So 1,000 kilos makes a ton, a metric ton, not the English ton. And a gigaton is 10 to the 9, all right? So it's got 9 zeros. That's a gigaton of carbon. So these numbers, this is the measure in gigatons. So it's a huge amount. It's a huge amount of carbon, of course, throughout the entire surface of the Earth. Okay? So annually, it is estimated that just the microorganisms, the decomposers, these microorganisms that are breaking down organic material, right? They're breaking down organic material, right? Is mostly what groups? We got the bacteria, and we got the fungi, the saprophytes, the decomposers, right? Mostly on the ground or near the surface. They produce about 60 gigatons of CO2 because they are respiring, they're alive. Mm-hmm.
How many?
Sorry, about 60 gigatons, the microbes, all right, that are rotting. This is essential because in that they are decomposing the organic material back into nutrients that can be reabsorbed by the plants. So we have to put up with that 60 gigatons to keep them alive. Another 60 gigatons estimated is produced by plant respiration. That's why the arrow is going up, plant respiration. So basically, the vegetation to stay alive on the surface of the Earth has been estimated that the metabolism, the cellular metabolism, cellular respiration of the plants, of the vegetation on Earth, produces approximately 60 gigatons of CO2 per year, all right? So it's about half and half, interesting. However, through photosynthesis, those same plants that are respiring are absorbing about 120 gigatons of CO2. So right there, just on the green numbers, we have a balanced system, right? The plants get to respire, so we can see that from these numbers alone, we can say that essentially plants produce twice as much energy, if you will, or how to make the equivalence. Okay, so they produce 60 gigatons of CO2 by respiration, but they absorb 120 gigatons of CO2 by photosynthesis. So they only produce half of CO2 as the amount that they absorb. All right, so that's why they're definitely a good thing. All right, so they basically, so the net is zero. The net on land is zero. In other words, it's balanced. They absorb their own CO2 plus the CO2 of the saprophytes, which are not photosynthetic. The bacteria and the fungi, they're consumers, right? Metabolically. And so we have a balanced system on Earth, and it stands to reason because that balanced system has been here for eons without us influencing, and it's been balanced. You know, we don't see catastrophic mass extinction of the plants or the saprophytes on Earth without any kind of drastic climate change. it stays, and it's a balanced system. All right. In addition, photosynthesis can do extra, can actually absorb 3 of the 9 gigatons that industry is producing, 9 gigatons of CO2. Okay, so let me back down for a minute. Here we can put a number on it now. Basically what we're doing, this is qualitative, and the next slide is quantitative. We're putting numbers on these arrows, okay? So this human influence CO2 production is estimated to be about 9 gigatons a year annually. Here it is, all right? That's all of the industry of the whole world. Doesn't seem like much, but it's significant.
Which
Again,
means, Father, that if we keep increasing the production by fossil fuels, we need more plants to absorb
right.
that CO2.
Exactly, and then it's anybody's guess how many more plants do we need. And when we add to this issue the increasing desertification that is happening of Africa, for example, that is going to less plants. And when we add the impingement on the environment by human activity like agriculture, which is less efficient than a forest because simply of biomass density, you know, then we're actually eating into the plant efficiency, all right? And so we're altering this ratio, basically. We're altering the ratio. Of these 9, 3 can be absorbed as it is now by the plants, by the photosynthesis. So photosynthesis does 123, if you will, more, all right? It's a good thing. Now let's look at the ocean. Whereas on land, the microbes and the photosynthesis combined were producing 120 gigatons of CO2. In the oceans, it's estimated that life in the ocean produces about 90 gigatons of CO2. This would be all the animals in the ocean, including not only fish, but also the cetaceans, the whales, and the porpoises, and the dolphins, which are marine mammals. It would include also all the invertebrates, crabs, lobsters, you name it. Every animal is metabolizing, which means cellular respiration, which means production of CO2, which means that eventually that will come out of solution at some point at the surface, all right? Plus the plant material that is in the oceans, that is also metabolizing because it's alive and it's respiring and it's producing some CO2. It means it's a combination of algae and also the phytoplankton, the plankton, the plant component of plankton that is called phytoplankton. The animal component is called zooplankton, all right? And that's in the upper 3 or 4 feet of the ocean. But again, that 3 or 4 feet is 3/4 of the Earth's surface. So that's a lot of square footage, all right? That is just blanketed with microscopic plankton. And the upper layer of it, very thin upper layer, is phytoplankton. Think of it as the grass of the ocean. That is microscopic, but it's real, it's there. It's mostly algae. And it's being consumed by microscopic zooplankton. And that zooplankton is going to be the first level of consumers in the ocean. They would be the herbivores. And then some other plankton that's a little larger will feed on those guys, and so on and so forth, until you get to a little larger that we can actually see by the eye on the plankton side, which is, for example, krill, which are little shrimp like that, that whales feed on that. So you can see that that phytoplankton is essential for keeping the whale alive, several layers down. All right? So all those living things on the ocean produce about 90 kilotons or gigatons of CO2. But because there is photosynthesis happening also in the oceans, who's photosynthesizing in the ocean? I just mentioned one. The algae, which can either be in the benthic and the bottom of the ocean, along the coast, etc., or most of it is floating on the surface, the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton is absorbing a prodigious amount of CO2 because it's photosynthesizing. We don't see it by the eye because it's microscopic, but it's there, okay? And so it is absorbing 90 gigatons, in other words, a balanced system of the CO2 that's produced by all the living creatures on the sea, the phytoplankton mostly, and other algae and other plants absorb the 90 tons, plus an extra 2 tons of the 9. Okay? So of the 9 that we're producing, and since we don't photosynthesize, right, it's just production of CO2, of the 9, 3 go here to land, through the land photosynthesis, and 2 gigatons go through the ocean photosynthesis. 3 plus 2, 5, minus 9, net 4, annually. Net 4 annually. For decades now, because these guys have been going on essentially since the Industrial Revolution. Okay, of course, it wasn't as drastic as it is now. Frankly, I mean, this is a recent graph, I would say, within the past, let's say within our decade, all right? Since the year 2000, more or less, okay? This is the production, but this is an increase in production, and this is the challenge. Because the CO2 is a greenhouse gas, which retains heat, and the black here is supposed to symbolize the retention of heat from the sun, warming. The net result is warming the atmosphere, which is going to have an impact on melting ice and other issues. All right, so a concern. Another cycle, oxygen. So we're looking at the main ones, right? The water, the CO2, the oxygen. Now, again, oxygen in nature, because these are natural cycles, oxygen in nature does not appear, excuse me, just as oxygen, just as O, right? As a single element. It likes to combine with itself to be stable, and so it's O2. And this is called diatomic. This happens to a number of gases, elemental gases, that are just dissolved in the atmosphere. Diatomic, the di is a reference to 2, all right? So we got diatomic oxygen. We also have diatomic nitrogen, N2, in the atmosphere, when we'll get to it in the next cycle. So quickly, the oxygen cycle is actually varied because it has oxygen is either diatomic, which will be in a gas form, or it could be trapped in the water molecule. Then it's going to be in a liquid form, or it could be trapped in the CO2 molecule, which again will be in a gas form. So it depends on where that oxygen is going to be, it's going to follow its own cycle. And that's what we have 3 basic colors here. We got the blue color, which is going to be the water cycle, a trapped oxygen in the water cycle, right? Then we got the black color, which is the normal diatomic oxygen gas through mostly respiration. And then we have the CO2 cycle, like we covered before, okay? So basically of these 3 cycles where oxygen may occur in relatively abundant amount in nature, we've already covered the blue water cycle, the red CO2 cycle. So the other cycle is just diatomic oxygen, which also is in the atmosphere. It also mixes with the air, like I say, oxygenation or aeration. This is essential that aeration occur in the oceans or in any kind of natural water to keep what? To keep the water aerated, because the animals in the water, even if they have gills, and especially they have gills, what is their source? So do animals in water breathe? Yeah. And how do they breathe? Strictly aquatic animals, let's stick to fish, all right? So do they have lungs? They don't have lungs, so they don't deal with gas, water, gas, air as such, gas, oxygen like we do, all right? The oxygen is changed through lungs. What do they have? Fish, their equivalent or their analogous structure is the gill. But the gill is absorbing oxygen from where? Yes, but it's not breaking the water molecule because that's a very high energy bond, and the gill doesn't have the power to break a water molecule, all right? The oxygen that the gill absorbs is oxygen that is dissolved in the water. So it's oxygenated water, it's aerated water. So much so that when the water becomes stagnant, in other words, the water loses its oxygen, the fish will die. They will literally asphyxiate to death because they have no source of oxygen, all right? So water has to be flowing through the gills of the fish, and in that flow, it's going to be analogous to the alveoli doing the gas exchange. And by the way, the fish will also pump out, secrete CO2 because they're metabolizing, and they absorb O2, diatomic oxygen that is dissolved in the water. And what is a physical force that dissolves oxygen into the water, that keeps the water aerated in nature?
Is it the current?
More than the current is actually the wave action on the surface, and especially the waves breaking at the surface. When the waves reach the surface here, but also just the normal breakers of waves, what we call the los carneritos, what do we call that in English? The white caps. When you look at the ocean and you see out and you see white caps, those are little waves breaking up, all right, at the surface. They're oxygenating the water. They're maintaining the oxygen in solution in the water so that the fish can breathe, and other invertebrates also, because the same with fish are all the crustaceans, lobster, crabs, shrimp, all those guys, they all have gills too, right? So they have the same analogous structures. Okay, so water needs to be oxygenated in nature, aerated in order to maintain life in water, either salt water or fresh water. All right, so that's part of the water cycle there, of the air cycle, of the oxygen cycle, diatomic oxygen. Forward. Okay, another one is the nitrogen cycle. So we saw water cycle, we saw CO2 cycle, we saw oxygen, diatomic oxygen. Now, nitrogen cycle at the biochemical level looks a little bit complicated, but basically it's going to be, the biochemical is going to be mostly stored in proteins, all right? Or the protein chain, which is made up of amino acids. I understand that I've represented too much detail here, but we can start this molecule. This is an amino acid, about 20 amino acids that occur naturally, and here's the nitrogen. Okay, so this is the active group or the amino group here, and then the rest of the chain can vary. Will make the difference between alanine, asparagine, glutamic acid, et cetera, the 20 serine, etc., all the 20 amino acids. Chains of these lumping together, all right, on the chain here, will make a protein, or will make a, first, the chain just by itself would be a polypeptide. Each one of these is called a peptide, and the chain would be a polypeptide. As that goes into a three-dimensional structure, either by helices or sheets, are the two basic structures, three-dimensional structures. So the proteins, too much detail, as they'll start configuring three-dimensionally, winding upon itself, similar to what DNA does, an RNA, but more DNA, all right? They start making three-dimensional complexes into these, what we call the tertiary structure, which are gonna be the subunits of the final functional protein, which is finally known as the quaternary structure. So there's folding upon folding upon folding that develops a three-dimensional model, if you will, and that is going to be the functional protein as such, and it's actually called a protein complex because it's made up of subunits, all right? One example, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, which I think actually this is the one because it's so common, is composed of 4 subunits, and each one of the subunits is called a myoglobin. So each one of these would be a myoglobin, and 4 of these coming together in a symmetrical fashion form the hemoglobin as such. The hemoglobin, the heme, H-E-M-E, is referred to a nucleus of iron. which in Latin is ferrum, and that's where we get Fe for iron. Fe for iron comes from ferrum, and the nucleus is going to be one atom of iron, and that is called the heme group, Heme, and that's what makes hemoglobin, all right? The 4 subunits are globular structures of proteins, and that makes the active functional protein. When that hemoglobin goes from the tissue to the lungs at the alveoli, all right, what happens to that ferrum? Let me say it in common English. What happens to the iron at the alveoli? There's contact with the atmosphere, and what's in the atmosphere? Oxygen. So that iron rusts. It oxidizes. In other words, that atomic oxygen fuses with the ferrum, and it makes FeO2, iron oxide, which when we look at iron oxide, what's another name for iron oxide in nature or in the hardware or in the
Rust.
Exactly, rust. And that's why it looks reddish, all right? It's a brownish reddish color, and that's why blood tends to look reddish also. It's the oxidation of that heme, of that ferrum, which transports then that one molecule of hemoglobin will transport it in the RBC to the tissue where that O2 is absorbed into the cell for cellular respiration, and the heme group now will pick up a metabolic waste of the cellular respiration, which is CO2. FeCO2 will be now venous blood as opposed to arterial blood, right? Or return blood to the lungs, which they call it bluish blood, blue blood, but it's less oxygenated, and that's why it changes color somewhat or appearance. And then the CO2 is released at the alveoli. So that's the gas exchange there, all right? That's just one example on how proteins, thousands and thousands and thousands of proteins that essentially do the work in the body for metabolism. And that is possible because of nitrogen, because of this amino group, all right? Because the amino group makes the amino acids, and the combination of the 20 amino acids in chains make the proteins, make the polypeptides that make the proteins, and the proteins do the work, all right? So now in the cycle, we can start with animal protein that gets broken down by decay, and it goes metabolic waste, which could be ammonia. That ammonia goes into the soil, is broken down by the nitrifying bacteria into nitrates, all right? And then those nitrates some of them get pumped into the atmosphere, and some get absorbed by the root system. And then the one that goes into the atmosphere is just the atomic nitrogen, which is inert gas, goes in and out, and it makes that 3/4 of the composition. That's why there's so much nitrogen in the atmosphere, because of all this cycling here, the breaking down of organic nitrogen that gets pumped into the atmosphere passively. But some of it gets reabsorbed by the plant as nutrients, as nitrates and nitrites and nitrates. And then that is incorporated into the tissue of the plant, essentially the proteins of the plant, the amino acids of the plant, which get eaten by animals. And that gets incorporated into the tissue of the animal, which eventually gets broken down. And the cycle continues back and forth, okay? Okay, too much detail there, not to worry about it. Basically, a nitrogen cycle then has a combination from the atmosphere through living organisms incorporated mostly into proteins that are then broken down by decay, and the bacteria, the saprophytes, break it down into nitrates and nitrites, which are then absorbed as nutrients for plants, reincorporated into plant tissue, and then once the plant incorporates it into the plant tissue, it goes back into the food chain, right? Or the food web. So here is at the natural level what I've been talking about. Basically, we can start with the plants that will feed animals, will feed consumers that eventually die and decompose. And the decomposers, the bacteria and the fungi, will break that down into several steps of nitrogen components, ammonium, which will continue to break down into nitrates, and then nitrites first, and nitrates. It's the nitrites that actually get absorbed by the root system, but also bacteria break that down, nitrates, and release diatomic nitrogen here. That is the atmospheric component of the nitrogen, which can also get reabsorbed passively into the soil by other bacteria that are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These are very important, interesting bacteria. They tend to live in the root system of what? Plants. We're talking about root system, we're talking about plants, right? Have you heard of legumes? The legumes, right? The legumes are mostly beans, which are very nutritious, and they have a high protein content, right? Okay, so these are the culprits here. In the root system of these legumes is a symbiotic system where they have these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria absorb diatomic nitrogen and are able to fix it into the tissue so that the plant can absorb that by way of nutrients, okay? And so legumes are known for that, and that's why that's a good crop to produce, because under the ground, there's a lot of stuff happening by this nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which is essentially making nitrogen available for the plant as nutrient for it to grow, and it's going to be stored mostly in the pods of beans, right? Many different kinds of beans. So there's been a lot of artificial selection on beans, great variety of beans, the lima beans, the navy beans, the blue beans, and all the kinds of beans that we have. All right, nitrogen cycle. We're close to just 2 more slides before we take a break here. Okay, other natural cycles. Let's look at the composition of the human body by way of these elements that we're talking about. We talked about oxygen, we talked about carbon, hydrogen, we haven't talked about yet, and nitrogen. So we can see that the human body is mostly composed of oxygen. Now this oxygen is not diatomic oxygen, right? This oxygen is going to be taken up mostly in water, because the liquid in our body is mostly water. This is just looking at elements. Okay, but these elements are not floating around in gas. They are taken up in molecules, and the prevailing molecule is going to be water. Think about average about 80% when a baby is born is more, the baby is more hydrated, maybe 90, 95%, I don't know. As we age, our cells lose the capacity to retain water, so we dehydrate, and that's also why the skin shrivels, because our skin loses the capacity to retain water, all right? And so women go down to about maybe 70, 75% water in old age, something like that. Anyway, it's part of the aging process is a loss of water, which is going to affect metabolism. So that oxygen is mostly taken up by water, or it could be CO2, right? Or it could be diatomic that is being used for respiration, but most of it is water. Carbon, also, it's not just carbon that we have inside. Carbon is going to be taken up mostly in organic molecules, the backbone of the organic molecules. The carbohydrates, for example, jam-packed full of carbon. But every organic molecule is going to have carbon, a lot of it. So that's mostly the component of that. No carbon in water, right? Okay, hydrogen. Again, this hydrogen is going to be taken up mostly in water. There's other components, but also all the organic molecules are also kind of coated with hydrogen. A bond that is available on carbon, if a carbon is not binding to another carbon or to a nitrogen or something like that, it's going to bond to a hydrogen because the hydrogen stabilizes. Carbon is a tetrahedron. It has 4 bonds sticking out, all right? If you can picture it, has 4 bonds sticking out, and if any of those bonds are not taken up by other carbons or nitrogens or other molecules, is going to typically be taken up by hydrogen, which will saturate the molecule, stabilize the molecule. Then the nitrogen, again in proteins, but other organic molecules also. And then finally that 4% of these, so imagine these are only 4 elements. 4 elements make up 96% of our body, just 4 elements. In the different molecules, of course, that are the life molecules. In that other 4%, all of the stuff is crammed in. Phosphorus, sulfur, all these minerals that are necessary for life: calcium, potassium, sodium, chlorine, magnesium. We're down to trace elements here, typically below 1% or maybe even 0.1%, but still essential for life. Like, for example, iron. Take out the iron from hemoglobin, dead, right? And they're down to trace elements. Also, many of these are metals: manganese, iodine, copper, chromium, cobalt, silicon, zinc, boron. Who else? Who knows what else we have inside that is at the trace element, but necessary for life, okay? All right, so that's as far as the basic components. These are the 4 cycles that we saw, okay? And all these others fit in other cycles that can get pretty complicated. Basically, they maintain metabolism, which translates into life. And then just finally to mention briefly hydrogen, because hydrogen is a very tiny amount, look at this, in the atmosphere, okay? 0.00005% of the atmosphere is hydrogen. It's a very small fraction of hydrogen in the atmosphere, which is a good thing because it is highly flammable. It tends to blow up. Like, for example, the sun, which is a huge mass. Imagine the size of the gas bubble of hydrogen in the sun that it has been burning for billions of years, okay? And it's still going on for several other billions of years. And that mass of hydrogen is so large that it actually exerts gravity on the whole planetary system, on the 4 major planets, the 4 inner planets, the 4 outer planets, and the other 4 dwarf planets that we talked about in the geosphere, okay? So imagine the massive volume of hydrogen gas that, because it's in space, then it's going to be 3-dimensional, and gas in space is going to take up, if there's nothing else impinging on it, is going to take a spheric shape, right? A ball. But it's burning. And that's just one sun out of the Milky Way, which has millions of suns. And the Milky Way is just one galaxy out of millions of galaxies that are there. So essentially what we have is all these huge balls of hydrogen and other gases that are flammable burning throughout the universe, okay? Burning away and going through their own cycles of millions or billions of years. But the very tiny fraction of hydrogen that we have in the atmosphere and on Earth, again, essential for life, because without the hydrogen, we couldn't have the organic molecules, right? We need carbon and hydrogen. We couldn't even have water, H2O, right? And so on. So as flammable as it is necessary. And so the delicate balance that exists. These are the 4 groups of macromolecules: the carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids, all jam-packed full of hydrogen. So all these radicals on the edges, those are all hydrogens, okay? Okay. Well, you've been extremely patient to bear with me for about 2 hours here. So we're going to take a break and come back and look at human cycling, human recycling. So let me pause this recording and we'll be back. Okay, welcome back everyone. So we're going to continue now for a little while looking at human recycling, and what was mentioned at the beginning of class, that we are the only species that actually produces waste, and it's not easily recyclable, all right? Unlike the other organic waste that animals and plants produce, that gets recycled fairly easily, and in fact it's incorporated into the life cycle of other organisms, basically the decomposers, right, the saprophytes. Okay, so we can classify our waste into about 5 different categories. And this is mostly the solid waste. It will be wood, metal, glass, plastic, or electronic parts. Okay. So wood, metal, glass, plastic, and electronic parts. Wood includes also all the wood products, as paper, for example, cardboard, fiberboards, fiberboard, a lot of the sheetrock and things like that is also made up with wood fiber. Even furniture, wood composites, that pressed wood fiber that makes for furniture. Metal, of course, all kinds of metals, small, large. We can think of large metals like cars and trucks and ships and planes. Opelika Airport here, they used to have so now there's a recycling plant. I've been coming here for about 11 years now, and I used to live in Hialeah. So I would take 37th Avenue up and down going south from campus. And almost every day I would go by the corner there of 37th and I guess it's about 154th or something like that where Opelika Airport is, the southern part of Opelika. Now there's a big station of Amazon redistribution center there. But I remember a few years back that the southern part of the Opelika Airport, way away from the runway, of course, and near the road, near 37th Avenue, they used to put old planes there and dismantle them little by little, chunk by chunk. You know, they have the motors on one side and wings and other parts on the other side, and they'll be pre-selecting all that airplane, which is now trash. What do you do with an airplane? You dismantle it. Now think of the ships, think of cruise ships and things like that. That is actually happening in India, for example. That is an atrocious thing. They bring those cruise ships, the old ones, onto the shore by thousands of people pulling on lines, on ropes. There's some YouTubes on that. They pull these ships to shore, and then they proceed to just like a graveyard of the big tankers and old cruise ships. And over the next several years or decades, thousands of people go on top of the ship and proceed to dismantle it and sell little chunks of something, all right, of metal. And that's how many of those ships are being dismantled down in the southern hemisphere somewhere, typically in very poor areas of the world. And the conditions there are atrocious, as you can think, because there's no law or enforcement of law. It's every man for himself. It's very brutal. Anyway, that's going on. Glass is, all of these, the first three are fairly easily recyclable today through industry and can actually make a profit to the point that recycling these products, at least the first three, wood, metal, and glass, industry has figured out a way to make a profit on these. A lot of it is remanufacturing old cars, broken down cars will eventually become metal for new cars and so forth, okay? Plastics is a challenge, but it can be done. The problem is just the sheer volume, the excess of plastic that we're producing in all kinds of materials. Everything is wrapped in plastic, 2-3 containers of plastic to get to the product, and all that is discarded. So we live in a very throwaway society, okay? Now, one that is even more challenging is the electronic parts, which is typical of our own time, the past few decades, I would say 30, 40 years. Old computers, old TVs, you know, the tube TVs, all that has to go somewhere. Who dismantles that? It's labor intensive, it's expensive. You can't just crunch it down and make something out of it, all right? The components have to be taken apart. Again, all this ends down in the Southern Hemisphere, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and the poor people just live in these huge dumps. They go out there and they pick parts out over years and years. Of course, the life expectancy is very low because there's a lot of contamination and the soil and everything. Sometimes they burn it. So you have this burning plastic and the toxic waste and smell. So it's pretty drastic, okay? Pretty drastic. We are unaware and oblivious of what's going on, but it's going on. All right, now focusing on the plastic, you have heard of, maybe you have heard of these, the giant plastic garbage patches that are in the oceans. And they are associated with the gyres. Remember we saw these 5 large gyres or vortices, if you will, of ocean. 2 in the Pacific, 2 in the Atlantic, and then 1 in the Indian Ocean. And because they are rotating slowly but surely over a period of time, they start vortexing, they start concentrating material toward the center, just like any other vortex. And they're beginning to show material that is in all of these gyres, but the one that is most significant is this one here, what is known as the North Pacific garbage patch. Now, you go through it, and it's not like you're going to find a huge island of plastic floating around all tangled together. No, it's broken down to microplastics and microfibers. And that's the challenge. That is mostly microscopic. There's also macroscopic thing that we can see with the eye, all right, floating around bags and bottles and whatever. But most of it is breaking down with time, and the combination of forces of the ocean, the salts, and the sun and so forth, they break it down, but they break it down into microplastics. And then those microplastics, which are literally microscopic fibers, are getting into the food chain, being absorbed by crustaceans, and then the fish eat the crustaceans, and then we eat the fish, and we end up with those microplastics. And there's some speculation now that one of that side effect could be to irritate the immune system, for example. Now we have microfibers inside our body we could have in an increasing amount, you know. So who knows? I mean, this is pervasive. They're basically being found in all the oceans of the world, these microplastics, microfibers, in different amounts. So we have to get very creative about recycling, even if it's just for the selfish reasons of maintaining the human species alive.
Where does it come from? Like, how does it get into the ocean?
Right. It's a huge source. It's a very varied source, right? So the sources are multiple. There are legion of the sources in biblical terms. But you can imagine any kind of plastic, since it tends to float, it will move through water until it hits out to the ocean, because most water ends up in the ocean one way or another, either through sewage or river runoff or deltas and so forth. So I'm going to show you a few films where people have gotten creative and they're making lemonade, as it were, out of these lemons. Basically, the starting is an expanding industry that is developing on recycling, right? And on reducing contamination and even restoration and remediation, which is restoring natural areas, fairly large natural areas that have been impacted either by human impact or even before the human. For example, this desertification is very evident. What you're seeing here on the slide is not a painting, all right? This is a photograph. This is one of those satellite photographs that has been expanded two-dimensionally, and that's where you get the contortion or the aberration on both the North Pole and the South Pole, because this is making a surface out of a flat surface, right? This is flattening out the surface of a sphere, basically is what I'm trying to say. And that's why it's distorted down here and up here. But in the middle is fairly well to scale. The dotted line is the equator. So you see the two big lungs of the Amazon basin and the Congo basin. Then there's this huge desertification in northern Africa, increasing. Of course, when it goes north, it runs into the Mediterranean, but south, it could impinge on the lung. Arabian Peninsula, then all this area is Southeast Asia, which is pretty tropicalized, a lot of biodiversity here. Australia also has a huge desert in the middle. And then this is mostly China here. We're going to look at this area, this Mongolia, some deserts some creative activity that is being done here to reclaim some of the desert in Mongolia by the Chinese. Okay, so, oh yes. So here's the first video describing the North Pacific garbage gyre, garbage patch. Hopefully the sound will be okay.
Hey, I want to show you something. Go ahead and skip this video if you don't like gadgets. But I'm a dad, and I found...
We'll skip the video, because none of us are dads. Stop here. Go back to high volume. Okay. So this is a project to try to get a grip on the Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
Plastic pollution is one of the biggest threats the oceans face today. But how much do we really know about it? On its mission to solve this problem, the Ocean Cleanup just published the most advanced research ever on the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, the largest accumulation zone of ocean plastic on the planet. Scientists have been studying this area since the 1970s, mostly by dragging a small sampling net through the ocean. The Ocean's Cleanup's researchers believe this method was valid only for small debris and covered too small an area to reliably measure larger debris. So, in the summer of 2015, the Ocean Cleanup launched the mega expedition, crossing the patch with 30 boats simultaneously. In addition to using many small nets, 2 giant trawls were towed behind the fleet's mothership. In total, they brought back 1.2 million plastic samples. All were hand-counted, identified, and classified by type and size. A monumental task, taking a team of lab technicians 2 years to complete. However, the largest debris appeared less frequent and more scattered. Quantifying the debris required an area 20 times larger than the mega expedition to be covered, something only possible from the sky. The Ocean Cleanup ran the first ever aerial surveys of a garbage patch by converting a former military aircraft into a high-tech research platform. Cutting-edge sensors allowed them to reconstruct the 3D shapes of large debris to calculate their mass. The results of all this work? The Great Pacific Garbage Patch measures 1.6 million square kilometers. That is 3 times the size of France. The patch contains 1.8 trillion pieces of plastic, which equals 250 pieces per every human in the world. The total mass amounts to 80,000 tons, 4 to 16 times more than previous estimates. 92% of this mass is made up of the larger objects, all of which are destined to fragment into dangerous microplastics over the next few decades, if left under the effect of sun and waves. And because the findings show that pollution in the patch is increasing exponentially, the plastic is unlikely to go away by itself. These results paint a new picture of the problem and provide a baseline for the cleanup of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, set to start in 2018.
Okay, so that's a good little summary. It packs a lot into a few minutes of information, and it gives you the picture of what's happening here. That's one example. Like I say, all the major oceans of the world are exhibiting some degree of garbage patch, but it's not as drastic as this one, which is in the North Pacific, okay, in that gyre. Also significant is, if you think of the whole coastline of the Pacific, even the North Pacific, whether it's North America or Asia, that's all super populated by all kinds of human populations, right? Okay, so we're going to move on now and see how some people are making. Okay, so let's drill a little bit deeper into the issue of the microplastics, which are made up of 2 main components, either microbeads or microfibers. Right, either beads or fibers. The microbeads are actually visible to the eye, so they're mini beads. Technically, they're not micro, they're mini beads, but the fibers are anything less than 1/10 of a millimeter being about the thickness of a nail, approximately. So 1/10 of that, and that's beyond sight, but also because it's beyond sight, then it's potentially more dangerous, right? Because we're not as aware of it. But it can get into the system and it can get down into the cellular level of the organism. So here's a couple of little videos explaining that.
It was completely legal to dump plastic in the ocean until the 90s. And a lot of that plastic is still there because plastic lasts out there for a very long time. It just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces.
Is that a solution?
We know that over 300 species of wildlife have ingested this material. It's been reported in animals. And so as it is eaten by animals, it actually can move up the food web. And as the scientific literature on this issue increases, literally almost every habitat they've gone to, seamounts, Arctic ice, coral reefs, deep sea, it's become ubiquitous. And I don't think anybody would fight anyone on an argument that plastic debris has not become a contaminant of concern.
That photo, by the way, I want to go back to it for a moment because it's significant and relevant. Okay, this is a bird, a seabird, obviously dead. And what we see inside the seabird, the gut is totally cluttered with plastic parts, mostly caps. And what happens is that these seabirds are flying around the ocean, all right? And they see this little cap bobbing and they think it's a fish or something, they go after it and they swallow it and they don't have a way of digesting that. That gets stuck in there, you know, and it fills them up and they eventually die of starvation because nothing else fits in there once the gut is full of these caps. So that's one particular challenge, is the actual plastic caps of all these bottles, you can imagine. That's why I really think that we need to get rid of water bottles. We're just making people rich, but I've been here for almost 50 years, always drank city water. And I'm fully alive and nothing has killed me yet. So I don't think I'm that rare, right? But water bottles, no good. Okay, we were around here.
Concern.
Chesapeake Bay.
We're collecting the samples by using a manta trawl. It's basically a big metal box with wings. It looks like a manta ray with a very long, about 12-foot mesh net off the back. 1, 2, 3, splash! And at the end is a piece we can take off, which has collected all of the solid. You rinse it all out, filter it through another strainer, and then put it into a jar. It's caught a lot of other stuff. If you want to take a look at what we're rinsing out of the screen, it's more tiny plastic.
What we're concerned about ultimately is what are the implications of trash going into the water, getting into the food we harvest? And we're still connecting the dots there a bit. We know that lots of trash goes out into the water. We know that the sun and waves breaks it down into small pieces. We know that many, many, many species of animals eat it. And we also know that bigger animals eat smaller animals. And we also know that we eat those big trophy fish. And so what we're really trying to figure out is how big a vector plastic is for transporting chemicals into the tissues of the animals that we eat every day. That's a big problem, much bigger than big chunks floating out into the ocean.
We don't know exactly what that plastic is. We don't know where exactly it's coming from. And if we're trying to find policy and educational solutions to it, we need to know what we're targeting. We can't just ban plastic. That's not going to work. What kind of plastic is it, and what's the best policy route to reduce it? Is it a ban? Is it a fee? Is it market change? Is it education and behavior change work? What's the best way to tackle it? And until we know exactly what we're dealing with, we're not going to be able to design the right programs to address it.
Complicated.
Good grammar and spelling are important.
Wait,
But if you want to write essays that
sorry. Okay, that was, let's look at microbeads here and microfibers a little longer.
There's been a lot of attention lately on the tiny additives in our shower products. It seems, without many of us realizing, they've been stuffed full of plastics.
Microbeads.
They're designed to make things a little bit rougher and to get a better clean, but a lot of the products that they're used in go straight down the sink and then out into our lakes and rivers and oceans.
Called microbeads, these tiny plastics have been causing so much alarm that supermarkets are in the process of banning the bead from their shelves. But in the stomachs of our seafood, researchers are mostly finding a different kind of microplastic.
Major thing that we were finding were these fibers, and so that really begged the question, where do they come from?
They're going down our household drains at an astonishing rate, but barely anyone seems to realise.
If animals that we're eating are eating plastic, we could potentially make that assumption that these chemicals are in our seafood.
What kind of microplastics are ending up in our marine life, and how much damage can they actually do? When I decided to take a closer look at microbeads, I didn't realise just how close I was going to have to look. So small, aren't they, these tiny little beads?
Oh, they're tiny. They're getting sizes right the way from 1 millimetre all the way down to several micrometers, if not smaller.
The man helping me filter these rinse-off cosmetics is ecologist Dr. Mark Brown. He's been consumed with the problem of microplastics in the oceans for more than a decade.
It is a huge problem. So if you look at the amount of plastic in the environment, over 85% of that is microplastic.
The problem with microbeads is they're so small you need a filter paper to catch them. They're too small for our water treatment systems, but small enough to be easily ingested.
Over recent years, the amount of research has increased, and we've started to show that they're persistent, bioaccumulative and toxic.
3 years ago in the US, scientists trawling for microplastics in the Great Lakes found concentrations as high as 400,000 particles per square kilometre. They were amazed by how many tiny spherical beads they found in the mix.
It isn't just microbeads, it's much larger bits of plastic breaking down into the same micrometer-sized fragments. So we're really concerned as to whether or not these particles could be accumulating in humans and wildlife.
The evidence shows they are, even at the very base of the food chain. Zooplankton, for example, are a major source of food for fish, whales and seabirds. These were filmed under a microscope in just one drop of water. Normally, they draw algae towards their mouth by creating currents with their legs. But when tiny fluorescent particles of polystyrene are added to the water, they eat those instead. Microplastic is now regularly being found in wild-caught zooplankton in the North Pacific. Just through eating these tiny crustaceans, salmon are thought to be consuming around 90 particles of plastic a day. So these particles look so small that if you swallowed them, it doesn't look like they do much harm. I mean, don't they just sort of pass it right out the other side?
Well, this is what we thought until we started doing experiments whereby we were actually feeding these types of particles to them. We were astounded by actually what we found.
I'm much more disturbed by what Mark shows me next.
So we know that invertebrates, in particular mussels, are exposed to microplastics in the environment. What we really wanted to find out is whether or not these tiny particles of plastic get any further than the stomach itself. So we exposed these mussels to tiny particles of polystyrene, and we then tracked these particles in the tissues of the mussel itself.
This footage, captured by marine scientists at the University of Connecticut, shows how tiny bits of plastic are drawn into the muscle and along the gill filaments. They get trapped here just like food particles and pass down the ventral groove into the muscle's mouth. But no one knew they could penetrate the gut barrier until Mark took samples of the muscle's blood. When the blood is analysed days later under a special infrared microscope, the molecular vibrations of plastic can clearly be identified.
Here you see right in the middle of the actual slide there is the polystyrene bead.
So that means that the plastic has made it from the stomach of the muscle into the circulation?
It has, yes.
That's astonishing. So how long have you seen the particle remain in the circulation?
They've lasted in the actual muscle 4 months. But more disturbingly, as these particles of plastic get smaller, which is what they'll likely do through the breakdown in the environment, the rates of transfer actually increase massively. The concern that we have really is that it can cause inflammatory responses. So the body of the muscle itself recognizes it as a foreign particle and starts attacking that. Because the particle can't go anywhere, you get scar tissue forming around that.
But the reaction to a foreign body in the tissues is just one of the side effects. What's most concerning researchers is not just the physical damage caused by microplastics when they're ingested, it's the toxic load from the chemicals they carry. One of those researchers is Dr. Chelsea Rockman from the University of California.
I'm an ecotoxicologist, so I look at the fate and effect of chemicals and plastic debris in our environment. Plastic is kind of like a little sponge for a lot of the chemicals that are already out there, the pesticides, the flame retardants, industrial chemicals, etc. Plastic concentrates, hyperconcentrates these chemicals at very large concentrations, sometimes 1 million times what we find in the water column. So PCBs, which were banned in the early 80s, DDT, which was banned in the early 70s. And I find these on every single piece of plastic I take out of the ocean. Metals like copper, lead, nickel, cadmium.
Plastic also contains unique chemical additives of its own from the manufacturing process, such as flame retardants and antimicrobials.
So the big question there was, do these chemicals associated with plastic debris end up in animals when they eat them? So basically we set up a study in the lab where we fed fish plastic that had these chemicals associated with them. We fed them environmentally relevant levels.
Dr. Rockman exposed Japanese Medaka to plastic particles that had been pre-soaked for 3 months in San Diego Bay. After just 2 months, higher levels of what's known as PBTs, or persistent bioaccumulative and toxic chemicals, were measured in the flesh of the fish, particularly flame retardants unique to the plastic.
So a lot of these chemicals are fat-loving and water-hating. But once they transfer from the water into that fat phase, so the fat in fish, they're incredibly persistent. I might have, a mechanism in my liver to take that PCB and break it down into a safer form. But once my liver is overtaxed, it might have a hard time doing that, and I'm going to start storing those chemicals in my body.
Chelsea predicted signs of damage would first be seen in the liver. Here she observed cell death and excess fat, a sign of liver overload.
Why the liver? Yeah, the liver filters, right, the toxins or anything that the body considers a toxin, like alcohol, for example. The liver gets the load. The liver is the one that breaks down medication also, right, drugs and all that. Mm-hmm.
One fish even developed a liver tumor.
And when we've taken fish in the lab and fed them the virgin plastic, it doesn't have this mixture of things from the environment, we see less of an effect in the fish. So this mixture is having an effect.
Even at very low concentrations, flame retardants are known to cause endocrine disruption, an effect observed in the fish.
Endocrine disruption is a disruption in the hormone system, which is what controls reproduction. So if that's not functioning, some people joke, if you don't reproduce, what are you here for? So it's a very important system.
Dr. Mark Brown also found chemicals transferred from the plastics to lugworms, a common marine sediment dweller.
We saw reductions in survival, reductions in immune function, and we saw a reduction in their ability to feed and process sediment. Things like triclosan, which is sort of an antimicrobial, is added to plastics, and that was one of the major killers of the worms.
Worms that process sediment are crucial for the survival of a complex food web of organisms.
And so when you remove these worms from the environment, you see a complete reduction in the numbers of animals and plants that can actually live on that shoreline.
These studies raise the important question: if chemicals can transfer from plastic to marine life, how much of our seafood is eating plastic?
It's great, right?
I got it. It's huge though. Well, maybe it's huge. Let's see.
Here in Sydney Harbour, we're out catching some of the state's most popular eating fish.
Oh,
Or at least trying to.
This is called a tiddler. That's not what you're after, is it? Oh.
We've looked right the way throughout Sydney Harbour, which is a really big harbour, and we found a surprisingly high concentration of microplastics in the sediments, and up to 60 per 100 mils of sediment. That's a really high concentration.
So is that why you think you'll find plastic in the fish?
Yeah, so because we did find high concentrations in the sediments, the first thing we wanted to do was to see which species it was getting into, if any. And so we targeted the fish that were feeding on the sediment. And this is a mullet. This is really a target fish for us. And these guts in here are full of sediments.
So this is a popular eating fish?
It is popular. It's not quite as tasty as the bream. It depends on your taste. These bream are really tasty, so these are really targeted by the recreational fishers.
We're taking these fish back to the Sydney Institute of Marine Science, where researcher Jen Halstead has been looking through their guts for any traces of plastic. Her studies have revealed that 30% of the mullet and 13% of the bream have plastic in their guts. But typically, it's not coming from face scrubs or shower gels.
So I've just found something that looks suspiciously like a plastic. Do you want to take a look?
Yeah. Doesn't really look like a microbead at all.
Yeah, well, actually, most of the microplastics that we're finding are in these forms of fibres. So it looks a lot like what we've been finding.
So is that a plastic fibre?
Yeah, well, we actually don't know at this stage. It could be synthetic, it could be natural. That's why we need to take under further investigation.
These results mirror a study 2 years ago by Dr. Chelsea Rockman, who looked inside the guts of fish from both Indonesia and the US.
I'm collecting fish from local fishermen that are selling them for human consumption, either out of a local
Somebody's
market,
gotta do it.
straight off the dock, as you see here, or it's actually going through Pillar Point Fisheries over here, which then gets shipped.
Back in the lab, Chelsea discovered around a quarter of the fish from each country had debris in their guts, but the type of plastic differed.
So what you see back here is a really good example of a piece of plastic taken from a fish in Indonesia. So this is from a silverside, which is a planktivorous fish, actually about this big. And what's a little bit disturbing about this one actually is that people eat the entire fish. And this is an example of where this plastic actually would go to, be transferred to a human.
In Indonesian fish, all of the debris was microplastics from larger, broken down pieces. But in the US, Chelsea mostly found microfibers.
If you look closely at this, you can see like the actual, nylon intertwine. That does not look natural, plant-like.
Chelsea didn't pinpoint the source of the fibers, but with the help of vibrational spectroscopists at Sydney University, Dr. Mark Brown has followed the trail further.
The forensic techniques that we use, shine an infrared beam or laser onto the sample, and we use that absorbance and reflection of light to tell us the type of polymer that we're actually finding there.
The vibrational fingerprints of fibres found in Sydney fish do indeed match plastic, but from a source that to me was totally surprising.
When we match this to a database of polymers, it clearly identifies this one as nylon. The second one here matches to polyester, polymers used in clothing. They seem to have a high fiber diet, and it's full of synthetic fibers. They certainly seem to be the same types of fibers, same physical structure, same colors.
With the mullet, we caught 30% of them had a microplastic particle, at least one, in their gut at the time that they were caught. If you model that, it actually means that pretty much every mullet is eating at least one microplastic particle every 3 or 4 days.
I'm amazed, but Mark has suspected it all along. He's looked at multiple shorelines on 6 different continents, and in each case, fibres were the dominant microplastic.
We expected to find lots of small particles from either from the facial cleansers or from larger bits of plastic that had broken down. But the major thing that we were finding were these fibres. What was peculiar about what we were actually finding was the proportions actually matched the types of polymers used in the textile industry, not only in terms of the types of fibres, but also in the numbers.
The closer they were to sewage outfalls, the higher the concentration of fibres.
And we found exactly the same types of fibres, acrylic, nylon, polyester, being emitted from these sewage treatment works.
The simple answer seemed to be that fibres were escaping from washing machines.
So most of the fibres that we were finding in the environment were polyester. So we essentially chose some garments that are made out of polyester, things like fleeces, which are the poster child for sustainability because a lot of bottles get recycled into them. And we essentially put those into washing machines separately, and we counted the number of fibres that were coming off.
You probably haven't thought that much about the proportion of clothes we wear that are plastic. But today, around 2/3 of the clothes we buy are made of synthetic fibres. The so-called Eco-fleece sheds almost 2,000 plastic fibres each wash. Other polyester garments aren't much better.
They release similar quantities into the environment. It doesn't seem just to be one type of garment. They all seem to be doing it.
But can these thin fibres carry the same chemical load as the other more spherical plastics tested?
I think the toxicity of the microplastic particles will vary with their shape and size. So the fibres have an incredible amount of surface area. The more surface area, the more likely they are to actually carry those other contaminants, and they would then be transferring into the fish tissue.
Aside from the direct effects of eating plastic, chemical doses are already known to biomagnify up the food chain.
These chemicals might absorb to the plankton at the bottom of the food chain, and one fish eats 10 of those plankton. Now that fish has a larger dose, right? 10 times the dose of the plankton, and then several of those are eaten by a larger fish. And so the question is, how is plastic contributing to this thing where we're seeing these large concentrations of chemicals in top predators?
One of those top predators is us, and it's well established that toxic chemicals can transfer from contaminated fish to humans with serious side effects. With all the billions of people wearing plastic clothes, suddenly the problem appears a lot more diabolical than microbeads.
We've been speaking to the public, government and industry. Public voted this one of the most important issues to be sort of tackling. We've spoken to the government about it, yet they seem to be focusing on other activities, things like microbeads and also packaging. When we have gone to talk to clothing companies or appliance manufacturers for washing machines, the appliance industry and the clothing industry haven't been helpful.
Mark says a simple filter could be added to washing machines to stop all kinds of toxic fibres from reaching our seafood. And do we really need all the industrial chemicals added to our clothes and other plastics?
Seeing all sorts of chemicals come on the market, up to about 15,000 per day. The problem is that we're not doing the test to keep up with types of impacts that could be occurring. Which one's causing the impact and which one's is causing more of a worse impact? If we understand that, we can start making choices.
We need a healthy ocean because it is all connected, and our fate.
Okay, so apparently the microfibers are more serious, more insidious than the beads themselves, even though the beads tend to accumulate toxins. the fibers can get deeper into the tissue, and they're just essentially everywhere now. Okay, coming from clothing, imagine.
It's interesting how they said about the foods, because that's, I've seen that where it'll say this jacket was made with X amount of plastic bottles, and you think you're doing a good thing by buying it.
Right, yes, exactly. And exactly. So this is another type of cycling that's occurring, right? The plastic cycling. It's, maybe they may not even be aware of it. Like he said, he's spoken to government, he's spoken to industry, but it's still a work in progress. Okay, so this is kind of a downer. These things, they go way beyond our individual control for sure. But I'm going to show you now a few videos of some people doing something about it in different ways of recycling and remediation and even restoring a desert area in China. All right, so let's start with this one, which is some news about recycling the trash in the ocean.
Hi, I'm Alex Schultz. And I'm Andrew Cooper. In 2015, we took a surf trip to Bali, Indonesia, and saw firsthand just how bad the world's plastic pollution crisis really is. We wanted to make it our mission to solve this problem, and we have. We started cleaning the ocean by ourselves until 2017, when we started our ocean cleanup company, 4Ocean. Now, we've become the world's largest ocean cleanup company, employing captains and crews 7 days a week to clean our oceans and coastlines. We've operated out of 27 different countries, and to date, we've removed over 2 million pounds of trash from the ocean. And now, we're inviting you to join the Clean Ocean movement. All of our cleanup efforts are funded entirely through the sale of our bracelet. The 4Ocean bracelet is made from our ocean plastic and the recycled glass bottles that we collect. Every bracelet purchase helps fund the removal of 1 pound of trash from the ocean and supports the 4Ocean cleanup movement. So visit 4ocean.com today to become part of the solution.
Okay, so that was actually an ad. Ecological. But, no, it was part of the thing, but it caught my attention that these two guys should start doing something on that.
Hey, I want to show you something. Go ahead and skip this video if you don't like gadgets, but I'm a...
There might be a solution to the giant garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean. A Dutch group aiming to rid the oceans of plastic junk has announced it will begin efforts to clean up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch by 2018, 2 years earlier than originally intended. The organization Ocean Cleanup will use trash collectors in the form of curved booms and screens, which are suspended by anchors floating in deep water. The system will act like an artificial coastline, catching plastic debris as it drifts on the surface or just below the water. Once full, a vessel empties the system and transports the collected plastic to land for processing and recycling. The group plans to deploy up to 50 systems and expects to collect 50% of the trash in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in just 5 years. Ocean Cleanup's first pilot parts are now in production and will begin testing off the west coast of the US by year's end. Say no to safe spaces on YouTube. Support Tomo News at patreon.com/Tomo News. Here's what's currently being done about the plastic menace in our oceans.
Sieve-in device designed to keep the ocean clean. Australian surfers Andrew Turton and Pete Kuglinski, who are also best friends, decided to do something after they became frustrated with the amount of trash that was floating in the ocean waters that they spent much of their childhood playing in. The duo quit their jobs and invented the Sieve-in, which is what they hope will be a sustainable way to reduce the amount of garbage that is polluting the world's waters. Built from recycled materials, the Sieve-in is fixed to a dock with a water pump that runs on shore power. The pump brings water through the Sieve-in, which allows the natural fiber bag inside the device to catch the floating rubbish and debris before water is pumped back out. Users have the option of installing an oil and a water separator to the pump to clean the water that flows through it before the water is allowed to flow back into the ocean. The Sieve-in is lined with a natural fiber catch bag that collects floating debris. When the bag is full, it can be changed with another clean one, and the collected debris can be disposed of responsibly. Turton and Kuglinski are trying to raise enough capital to turn the Sieve-in prototype into a reality. According to Australia's ABC News, crowdfunding has helped the two men raise $50,000 for commercial production, and a video of the sea bin in action has attracted more than 10 million hits online.
Caterpillars could save the planet from plastic trash. After years of trying to find a way to get rid of plastic waste, scientists may have finally found a solution, courtesy of a drab little bug. Wax moth caterpillars that typically eat beeswax in hives have been found to also be capable of degrading plastic. Polyethylene is one of the most commonly used plastics, with strong carbon-to-carbon bonds that render it resistant to degradation. However, waxworms are able to make holes in a polyethylene bag in just 40 minutes, eventually eating through most of it in just a few hours. Researchers suspect bacteria in the guts of the worms are responsible for digesting the plastic and breaking it down into ethylene glycol, an organic compound. Scientists want to study the chemical process that allows polyethylene to be degraded and maybe adapt it into a solution for managing the world's plastic waste. Indonesia pledges $1 billion in war on plastic waste. Plastic waste is a major global problem, and second only to China, the world's biggest source of the pollutant is Indonesia. Responsible for a massive 54,000 kilometers of coastline, the Indonesian government is vowed to do its part to reduce plastic in the environment, with a pledge to spend $1 billion on the problem. And it is indeed a global problem, one which the United Nations has declared a war on. Each day, more and more plastic finds its way into our oceans. As plastic does not decompose, much of it collects in the open ocean, driven by currents. One such concentration is known as the Great Pacific Plastic Patch. Another of these floating patches is larger than France. Scientists believe the entire mass of oceanic plastic could outweigh all the fish in the world's oceans in 30 years. And today's estimated 165 million tons of the stuff in our oceans is already getting into our food supply. So you know what to do: reduce, reuse, and recycle. Take a reusable bag to the supermarket, refill that water bottle, and avoid foods with excessive packaging. Do it for those future grandkids, yeah? Say no to safe spaces on YouTube. Support Tomo News at patreon.com/Tomo News.
Ocean trash cleaning system to debut off Japanese island next year. A self-sustaining system designed to rid the world's oceans of millions of tons of floating plastic garbage is set to make its debut next year off the coast of Japan. The Ocean Array platform is designed to collect plastic trash that currently floats on or near the water's surface. The 1 mile wide array features 2 large booms on either side, which use ocean currents to direct the plastic towards a central receptacle. The trash is then filtered into a large trash receptor on the back of the floating platform for recycling. With solar panels and water-generated turbines below the ocean's surface, the platform is completely self-sustaining. The array will be installed near the Japanese island of Tsushima in 2016 as part of a 2-year-long trial.
See a story that really should be animated? Suggest stories to...
Okay. Mixed bag, but at least some creativity is going into the project. Well, this one's very interesting. This one is a Wall Street Journal interview with Tyson and waste management. Waste management, you know, the green garbage trucks. And Tyson Foods, which makes hot dogs and things like that.
In the chicken business, what do you do with all the chickens and what do you do with all that's left over, and how is this actually being profitable for both of you?
Okay, so I don't want the storyline here to be, though, that Tyson has great trash. Okay, we're going to do better than that. But if you look at our business, you know, we bring in, you know, 2 types of raw materials. First, the animals, the cattle, the hogs, and the chickens, which we process. or the other non-protein items, and then we bring in the raw materials we need to process those, right? So on the animal side, we're incredibly efficient. All we lose is the cluck, the moo, and the oink, right? And so we create value streams for all of the parts of the animal. Some go into animal food, some would go into pet food, some go into renewable fuels, those type things. So if you look at that stream, we're incredibly efficient. If you look at the other raw material stream, then that's the stream that generally creates some waste. And that's where great partners like Waste Management come in. And what David and his group have done with us is both support and challenge us to be as efficient as we can and to try to create as many value streams as we can. For example, let's take our pork division. It's kind of the freshest on my mind. We began with one of our pork plants to work through what we were doing to create waste that could not be valued up, right? So it may be organic contaminants on corrugated material and that type of thing. So they worked with us on programs.
Can I just interrupt? Can you explain that? I mean, you cannot recycle, apparently, corrugated cardboard if there's oil on it.
Right, because that's generally going to get sent back into the corrugated plants, which are then going to make packaging materials out of it. So we have to keep the streams separate and clean. So they worked with us on a program where we could train our team members, the value of those waste streams, but then efficient processes to separate the plastics, the wood, the corrugated materials, and that type of thing. And so kind of fast forwarding where we are today in our pork plants, about 70% of our waste stream is now recyclable. So very efficient, and it's been a great success story for us.
And it really brings home the point, right? Which is, when Donnie said it, what he's doing is lowering that conversion cost, right? I mean, we can't do anything about what we can sell that cardboard for, let's use, or for plastic or metal on the back end. Those are markets that we don't set the prices on. But what we can do is affect those conversion costs up front. So if we can lower the conversion costs now, even if the cardboard value comes down, it's still profitable to recycle. They can still save money doing it. And so that's what they've done. They've trained their folks to lower the processing costs, right? And that is what's going on. That's why I say you can't think of recycling as a homogeneous whole, because a business like Tyson has every incentive to do that because they can save money.
You are actually making a profit on recycling at the moment.
Yeah, we cover the cost, not by much, but we make some profit on what we recycle. Yes,
and that's after taking into account even the 30% that you can't recycle.
Right.
Okay. All right.
And so but when you look at residential recycling, different animal, right? I mean, that's what we've done in the last 10 years is we've tried to drive recycling rates up by doing what we call single stream recycling, put everything into one bin, right? Remember, when recycling first started, it was sort of done the way Tyson did it, which is we asked the consumer to separate it, and that drove down the conversion costs. We could do it profitably, but the problem was it was difficult for the consumer, and so you couldn't get as many consumers to do it. So we then moved to single stream recycling, mix all the components together, and we'll recycle it. We haven't done a very good job of.
You understand single stream recycling? Because I remember when we used to separate, right? The newspaper and the glass and the plastic, but now single stream means it all goes into that blue container, and then the plant takes care of recycling. The key issue is that single stream cannot be contaminated basically with organic waste, all right, with oils or residue from food, right, food products. That's the key.
Of educating the consumer as to what can be put into those bins. So the recycling rate goes up, but the contamination of the material, that cardboard with oil on it, goes up also because people put the wrong things in those containers. What does that do? Drives up the processing cost. The value on the back end goes down, and all of a sudden that's how recycling becomes unprofitable.
Single stream recycling, how much of what's in there should not be in there?
Well, it depends on what city you're in, but we have contamination rates.
Smarter recycling cities?
Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. We have contamination rates anywhere from 20% to 50%. Wow. I mean, when you have 50% contamination in recyclable materials, that's garbage.
Right. Let's start with what is.
I know on our bin, they have a sticker on top that tells you.
Oh, right,
So
that's
that
right.
hopefully you're looking at that.
Right. That, yeah.
Because years ago you have to look it up online.
Yes, it was a little more cumbersome. It required more, but now they try to make it so simple, iconographic, so, so people recognize what can go and what
I argue with my brother-in-law because I try to recycle as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I'm going to, it says they're going to separate it anyway. You're reducing the employer opportunity, to hire people to do that job.
Exactly. Exactly. They come up with weird things. But we're typical, the men, we're typical for not recycling, right? Oh, it gets thrown in the garbage anyway. People become so. Yeah, exactly. That's on a good day. What some of my peers tell me is, oh, afterwards the recycling truck goes to the same dump and dumps it in the same garbage bin, in the same trash as everything else. So it's a lot of cynicism out there, unfortunately. Okay, that one's single stream. I want to show you this one, the water wheel. I'll send you these links also you can look at it. We just got 2 or 3 more. But this one is creative. So I try to identify videos where just common folk out of interest and initiative wanted to do something. And they got creative and did some very interesting things. This water wheel, for example, is contraption. It runs totally on solar.
I think there's a little bit of apprehension involved in trying new technologies. And a lot of people heard the idea and said, that's pretty off the wall. I don't know if that'll ever work. I used to walk across this bridge every day and I would see the trash coming down the river and I'd hear the tourists.
This is in Baltimore Harbor, right? The Potomac empties out here.
Say, this harbor's disgusting. So I thought about it every day on my way to work, and this is the idea I came up with. And my partner Daniel and I enlisted his help to help put it together and put it in on May 8th.
So here we are on the Jones Falls in Baltimore's Inner Harbor on a rainy day, standing on the water wheel, and which is behind me here. You can see this is the water wheel being turned by the current of the Jones Falls, which is flowing very rapidly because we just had a pretty large rainstorm. And that wheel is turning this conveyor belt that is picking up all of this trash that is flowing down the Jones Falls. You see, we've got a lot of plastic bottles.
All want clean water. They all want the ability to swim or recreate in water without coming into contact with trash or sewage or stormwater pollution. And you can see a lot of that, especially online. There's a lot of concepts out there for cleaning up trash in the ocean. And just those concepts become very, very popular on the internet. And part of the power of the water wheel is that it's here, it exists. People can actually see it operating every day and cleaning up the trash. John is a huge inspiration to, I think, a lot of people. Here's a guy who solved this problem of just trash in the waterway, something that, thousands of us have been looking at for a very long time. And, he actually had the ability to think about the problem and come up with this brilliant device.
As you can see, it moves kind of slowly, but slow and steady in this case is just fine.
We've captured over 3 million cigarette butts from the water wheel since we installed it. Second to that, I would say plastic bottles. We've probably captured about 50,000 plastic bottles since we installed it. And then styrofoam, basically anything that floats. It's completely sustainable in that it's powered by hydropower, and when there isn't enough current in the Jones Falls, we have solar panels, which provide solar power to pumps that actually pump water onto the water wheel to keep it turning, even when there's not enough current.
So I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. Make her go. The water's being pumped in 2 stages, from the harbor up into this reservoir, and then from the reservoir up into the wheel. And so that's what's making the wheel go around today, because the river, we've had a dry spell and there's not much flow coming out of the river. Even on these dry days, we still get a fair amount of trash. It's like, a couple trash cans full, but after a storm, we'll get as much as a couple dumpsters full. So the power from the wheel, the turning wheel, is transferred to the conveyor and to the rake system through a system of gears, chains, belts, pulleys. So it doesn't really care if there's a big 2,000-pound log on it or just a load of styrofoam. It just keeps on turning.
So here we are once again at the back of the water wheel, seeing what kind of trash is coming over the conveyor belt today.
I love hearing people talk on their cell phones and just be like, you wouldn't believe what they have here in Baltimore. It's called a water wheel, and it's like solar powered. And so hearing that excitement from everyone has just been terrific. Ultimately, though, our goal is to actually put the water wheel out of business. We know that it's an end-of-pipe solution. It's great because it's immediate and it's innovative. But the real solution is that people need to change their behavior.
We've heard lots and lots of people say, oh, the harbor will never be clean. You can never get all the trash out of the harbor. I think, we're not taking all the trash out of the harbor, but we've made one big dent, a noticeable dent that's noticed by everybody who uses the harbor, who boats on the harbor, who lives on the harbor, who jogs the promenade. We had one article that said this is the most promising technology for keeping the plastic trash out of the oceans. And we're hoping just to clean up this harbor right now. But I think we can take it to a bunch of different places and make it a valuable technology or a valuable asset to keeping the oceans clean, the rivers clean, the harbors clean. It's a dirty job, but it's a worthwhile project.
Okay. This one, you remember the Deep Horizon? This one has to do with petroleum, oil spills. Remember Deep Horizon in the Gulf? In the Gulf of Mexico, that big petroleum spill 4 or 5 years, well, it's actually 9 years ago now, 2010. That was the largest oil spill in the history of the United States.
The species we study is called smooth cordgrass, and it's the foundational species along the coast of the northern Gulf of Mexico and along the Atlantic coast. This species is incredibly important for building land and keeping land from falling into the sea.
So it stabilizes the coast, like the mangrove.
We went out to several sites that received heavy oiling after the spill. We found that the bacterial community inside the tissues of plants shifted to incorporate more bacteria that are important for breaking down oil.
Bacteria that break down oil.
This is also really important because our collaborators have found that there's also oil inside of the plant tissues that still needs to be broken down. So it's possible that these bacterial shifts are going to be important for continuing to clean up the oil spill inside of the plant.
This is Bay Jimmy. It was one of the worst impacted areas after the Deepwater Horizon spill. And we used this shoreline to test different strategies for remediating the oil, for removing it from the surface. And after remediation, I went in and planted Spartina along the shoreline in different plots to compare what rates of erosion were like using different planted varieties versus leaving them unplanted after remediation. This stake right here is the back of a plot that we set up in 2011, where we were comparing planting versus not planting. And the plot extended 15 feet towards the water. And then in front of the plot was an additional 15 feet. And all of that's gone now. So since 2011, we have 30 feet of erosion up until this stake. Of Spartina alterniflora is it's a very powerful ecosystem engineer, which means that it physically impacts this entire ecosystem. So just the presence of the marsh here is dependent on the ability of Spartina to hold the substrate in place.
Spartina is like
the elegance of focusing on Spartina is that whether we're here in the Gulf or on the Atlantic or on the Pacific, there's Spartina everywhere. Some Spartina have been artificially introduced and have proven to be problematic, but the native Spartina and other congeners and related species that serve a similar function, that effectively engineer coastlines, can serve a similar purpose.
So now we're taking a closer look at these bacterial communities living symbiotically inside of root tissue to see if we can identify which bacteria are the best at biodegrading oil inside of plant tissue. And what we'd like to do is identify the best bacteria that we can use to inoculate plants in the future that are going to be used for restoration purposes. So instead of just putting a plant out there, we're going to put out a plant-bacterial combination. And that combination of organisms is going to help clean up oil faster.
The last one, it's only about 3 minutes. It's the one on that I told you about China, how they're restoring a desert that is in Inner Mongolia.
Father, there are also bacteria that they degrade heavy metals.
Heavy metals, huh?
They have a
Tremendous. Wow, spectacular.
They start like accumulating in the membrane.
Yes? And then what, they make a pocket out of it or something?
No, they start like degrading it.
Oh, yes? Tremendous, yeah. There's a lot of power in nature.
And usually they're extremophiles.
Ah, okay.
But they can do it.
Yeah, the extremophiles are interesting, but dangerous, right? Because they like extremes. But then again, if the conditions are not right, they're not going to make it. Typically, those conditions have to be mimicked in the lab.
Little, if any, rain and scorching temperatures. Not exactly ideal condition.
Okay. This is going to be on the Gobi Desert, or the in Inner Mongolia. If we look at Mongolia for a minute. It's a big central region of China, northern region here. Okay, and then above it is Russia, as you can see here. But this central region has a lot of desert. This desert that is also expanding. And of course, you can see just by the divisions here, all the segmentation of counties or regions, whatever, that it's a very heavily populated area. Here's Beijing. And this whole area is heavily populated along the coast. So they're doing this restoration project in the desert itself. This is starting. It's only a couple of minutes.
To support vegetation. But turning that logic on its head is this desert in North China's Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region.
According to our calculation, there are over 70 kinds of crops growing here. Many are not planted by us, but they just grow themselves.
Crops like corn, tomatoes, sorghum, and sunflowers, transforming more than 200 hectares of sand dunes into an oasis, all within 6 months. It's all thanks to new technology developed by researchers at Chongqing Jiaotong University. They developed a paste made of a substance found naturally in plant cell walls. When it's added to sand, it's able to retain water, nutrients, and air.
The cost of artificial materials and machines for transforming sand into soil is lower compared with controlled environmental agriculture and reclamation.
The research team has big future plans. This fall, it hopes to transform an additional 200 hectares of desert and possibly more than 13,000 in the next few years. The method could be promising for China. In 3 years, the country hopes to reforest 50% of degraded desert land that can be treated. By 2030, the United Nations is aiming to reach zero growth of desert farmland around the world. So China's breakthrough experiment in converting sand to soil is promising for making land seemingly hostile to life fertile ground. Francis Ko, CGTN.
Okay. Now, there are many videos of this actually going around. You can find a lot of them on the internet. But the exciting thing is that people are doing something about it, right? And either small groups or large groups, whole industries are getting into the whole recycling and remediation. Bioremediation is taking it one step beyond the recycling, is once they get rid of the contamination to restore that area back to its natural environment, okay? And that's bioremediation. All right, so we're gonna stop here, and then we're gonna go into energy cycles, and we're going to look at population growth, and then the whole issue of climate change to finish the course, okay, in the next 3 lectures that we have. I want to mention also that, remember, next Saturday we're not meeting, right? And we'll skip, so you actually have a little break there, and then we'll meet the following Saturday. Just look at the dates. We're off on June 8th, and we're back on June 15th. All right?
Okay, so we don't have class.
Right. Next Saturday is June 8th, because I have the rescate, the retreat, the prison retreat. So I'm tied up.
We have 3 classes.
So we have 3 classes left after that one.
15, 22nd,
and 29, and that's it.
And then we start in August?
We start in August, at the end of August, right? So you'll have about a month and a half break. You have July and half of August, more or less. Nice little break after we've been going at it practically every Saturday for a long time. Okay, if you don't have any questions, then we're going to stop here the recording. Let's see, was there, oh, it was a chat. Sorry, I missed this. Oh, yes, that was. Druselle was on call, so that's why she didn't come today. All right, so stopping the recording.